Hello story enthusiasts. Welcome to The Fiction Wizard. Today we venture into Kingsley Shacklebolt raided Privet Drive with a DMLE warrant at dawn. Vernon was in cuffs by breakfast. Your support means everything. Like and subscribe. Enjoy. Chapter 1. The warrant. The owl arrived at Kingsley Shacklebolt's desk at 11 minutes past midnight, and it dropped a sealed envelope so heavy with magic that the parchment smelled faintly of burning when he touched it. He didn't open it immediately. He set it on the desk, poured himself 2 fingers of fire whiskey he wasn't going to drink, and looked at the 3 files stacked to his left. 4 years of quiet documentation. Healer reports pulled from St. Mungo's archived intake records. A boy, age 11, presenting with healed fractures inconsistent with the stated cause. A Hogwarts school record showing a student who arrived underweight every September. The gap between July and September always the worst. Witness statements from 2 Muggle neighbors who had, separately, mentioned things to a local social services office that had somehow never resulted in a follow-up visit. Arabella Figg's formal deposition, notarized by a magical solicitor 3 weeks ago, 8 pages of precise and damning detail from a woman who had watched a child be diminished for a decade and had been told, gently but firmly, that it was necessary. The word had started to taste like ash in Kingsley's mouth. He picked up the envelope and broke the seal. The parchment inside was dense with ministerial script, gold ink that shifted slightly in the lamplight, and at the bottom, 3 signatures he'd spent 6 weeks carefully, quietly obtaining. Senior Auror Proudfoot. Senior Auror Savage. Head of the Magical Law Enforcement Patrol, Williamson, a man who had been a friend of James Potter's and who had signed his name so hard he'd nearly torn the parchment. At the top, in the formal language of the Department of Magical Law Enforcement, was the subject of the warrant. Vernon Dursley, residing at No. 4, Privet Drive, Little Whinging, Surrey. Petunia Dursley, née Evans. Dudley Dursley, minor. Charges to be investigated: systematic neglect, willful endangerment, and the sustained psychological and physical mistreatment of a minor magical ward under explicit ministry protection. Kingsley set the warrant down. He picked up his fire whiskey. He drank it. Then he stood up, shrugged on his coat, and went to collect his team. Surrey was cold for July, which felt appropriate. The sky was that particular pre-dawn gray that isn't dark enough to be night but hasn't committed to being morning yet, and Privet Drive was so aggressively, identically quiet that the 4 of them looked profoundly out of place simply standing on the pavement. Kingsley had chosen his team carefully: Tonks, because she was sharp and because she didn't flinch; Proudfoot, because his signature was on the warrant and Kingsley wanted him to see what it was for; and a young Auror named Calder who had spent 2 years in Magical Law Enforcement's Child Welfare Division before cross-training into the Auror Corps and who carried a documentation kit the way other Aurors carried extra wands. Tonks was looking at the houses with an expression somewhere between bafflement and unease. "They're all identical," she said quietly. "Welcome to suburban England," Kingsley said. "No, I mean, they're identical. Like, the same person designed them in a fit of something." "Conformity," Calder said. She was young, dark-haired, with reading glasses pushed up on her head and a quick quotes quill already in her breast pocket that she'd charmed to take factual notes rather than sensationalized ones. "You should see the inside of that house before you decide how you feel about the outside." She'd seen Figg's deposition. She'd also, Kingsley knew, looked up the Hogwarts healer intake records herself, because that was the kind of Auror she was, and she hadn't said much about what she'd found. She didn't have to. It was 5:47 a.m. "Standard approach," Kingsley said, looking at each of them in turn. "Proudfoot, you're with me at the front. Tonks, south entry, there's a side gate, it'll be padlocked, don't let it slow you. Calder, you document everything you observe from the moment we pass the property line." "Everything. Are we clear?" 3 nods. "The boy is 15 years old," Kingsley said. He didn't say it loudly. He said it the way you say something when you want it to sit in the room for a moment. His name is Harry Potter and he is a person, not a symbol, not an asset, not a security concern. Anyone who treats him as anything other than a frightened 15-year-old who is about to have a very strange morning will answer to me. Clear. Clear, Tonks said, and her voice had gone very flat and professional, which meant she was furious. Move. The wards around the property were Dumbledore's, and they recognized Kingsley's ministry credentials the way a locked door recognizes the right key, reluctantly, with a faint shimmer, stepping aside rather than welcoming. Kingsley noted that. He noted the way the wards were oriented too, outward-facing, designed to keep threats away from the property, not to protect the child inside it. He filed that thought away and kept walking. He knocked on the door at 5:52 a.m. Not loudly. Just twice, firmly, the way you knock when you're not asking permission. Nothing for 30 seconds. He knocked again, same way. A light came on upstairs. Shuffling. The sound of someone large navigating a staircase with the irritated energy of a man who'd been woken up and was already building to indignation about it. Then the rattle of a chain, the click of a deadbolt. There were 3 separate locks on the front door, Calder noted quietly and wrote down, and the door swung open. Vernon Dursley was a big man. Wide as a wardrobe, ruddy, with a mustache that seemed to exist primarily to communicate displeasure. He was wearing a burgundy dressing gown and the expression of someone who had been preparing a tirade before the door was fully open, and for exactly 2 seconds after he took in the sight of Kingsley Shacklebolt, 6'2", ministry badge already presented, 3 Aurors visible behind him, all of them looking at Vernon with the specific professional calm of people who have already decided how this morning goes. The tirade died. Vernon Dursley, Kingsley said. Yes, what's this, do you know what time? Kingsley held up the warrant. It caught the hallway light and the gold script glimmered. I am Senior Auror Kingsley Shacklebolt of the Department of Magical Law Enforcement. I have a signed warrant for your arrest and for the search of this premises. Step back from the door, please. Vernon's face went through several colors. Now see here, step back from the door. It wasn't loud. It wasn't a shout or a threat. It was the tone of a man who does not repeat himself because he does not need to, and Vernon Dursley, who was, Kingsley had long since assessed, a bully, and therefore an expert at identifying who and what he couldn't bulldoze, stepped back. Kingsley walked in. The hallway was neat, aggressively so. Family photographs covered the wall to the right in a way that would have seemed warm in another house, but Kingsley scanned them with the trained eye of someone who had been briefed and noticed immediately, not a single photograph of Harry Potter. Not one. 15 years of a child living in this house, and the walls showed a family of 3, then 4, then 5 as the blonde boy aged, and the 4th member of the household had been excised as thoroughly as if he'd never existed. Calder was writing. Petunia Dursley appeared at the top of the stairs in a cream nightgown, her face sharp and pale and instantly, precisely terrified in the way of someone who has been waiting for a knock on the door for a long time. Not the terrified surprise of innocence. The terrified recognition of someone who knew, on some level, that the knock would eventually come. Kingsley looked up at her. Mrs. Dursley. Please come downstairs. What is, Vernon, what's happening, downstairs, please, Kingsley said. I'll explain everything once, and I'll explain it clearly. She came down the stairs the way people descend when their legs have decided to keep moving regardless of what their brain is doing. A large boy, Dudley, 17, Kingsley noted, technically of age but assessed as not involved in the primary charges, peered from the landing above, took one look at the people in his hallway, and retreated with impressive speed. Kingsley let him go. The sitting room was beige and brass and very clean, full of the particular neatness of a house where appearance is a form of armor. Vernon had positioned himself near the fireplace with the instinct of a man who wanted something solid at his back. Petunia sat on the edge of the sofa and folded her hands in her lap like she was trying to hold herself together by interleaving her fingers. Proudfoot stationed himself at the door. Calder moved through the room in a quiet circuit, not touching anything, just observing, the quick quotes quill scratching steadily beside her. Tonks had gone around the side. "Mr. Dursley," Kingsley said. He stood in the center of the room without sitting because he wasn't a guest. "I'm going to read you the charges detailed in this warrant, and then I'm going to give you an opportunity to respond. After that, we'll proceed according to what the law requires." He unfolded the warrant. "The Ministry of Magic's Department of Magical Law Enforcement charges you with the systematic neglect, willful endangerment, and the sustained psychological and physical mistreatment of a minor magical ward, specifically, Harry James Potter, currently 15 years of age, who has resided in this household since the age of 1 year and 4 months." The room was very quiet. That's absurd," Vernon said. He'd rallied, found some of his bluster. "The boy is we've given him a home, fed him, put a roof over his, Mr. Dursley." Kingsley's voice was patient and completely immovable. "The charges include restriction of adequate nutrition over a sustained period, evidenced by medical intake records at his school. Confinement to a substandard sleeping space, specifically a cupboard under the stairs, for the first 11 years of his life. The use of physical punishment documented by Hogwarts school medical records. And the deliberate, systematic erosion of the child's understanding of his own identity and history." Petunia made a sound that wasn't quite a word. "We've also got," Kingsley continued, folding the warrant with the measured precision of someone who has more where that came from, "a sworn statement from Arabella Figg, a resident of this street, detailing specific incidents observed over a period of 9 years. And a statement from Harry Potter himself, taken lawfully and in the presence of an independent magical solicitor, 2 weeks ago." That landed. Vernon's face went the color of old chalk. "You spoke to him," Petunia said. It wasn't accusatory. It was almost wondering, like she couldn't quite process it. "We did," Kingsley said. "At length." He looked at her steadily. He was very composed about most of it. "That, in itself, tells you something." The sound from upstairs was Harry before they saw him, a creak, then footsteps, hesitant and quiet, the steps of someone who has learned to move through his own house like he's not supposed to be heard. He appeared in the doorway of the sitting room in jeans and a t-shirt that was too large for him by a factor that made Calder's quill scratch 3 words in quick succession and stop. He was thin in the way that had clearly been the norm for him rather than a recent development, and he wore glasses held together at the bridge with spellotape, and he was looking at Kingsley with an expression that Kingsley had seen before, on the faces of people who had been in very bad situations for a very long time and had been told so many times that the situation was fine, actually, that they'd stopped trusting their own read on it. The look of someone who wanted to believe help had arrived but had been let down enough times that he wasn't willing to let himself do that yet. Kingsley looked at him directly. "Harry. I'm sorry we woke you." Whatever Harry had been expecting, and Kingsley suspected the range of things Harry expected from adults was narrower than it should be, an apology hadn't been it. Something shifted in his face, very slightly. "I was already up," Harry said. He was 15. He looked younger and older than that simultaneously, in the way that children do when they've spent time in circumstances that age something in them while starving something else. He looked at his uncle with an expression that wasn't triumph and wasn't fear. It was something more complicated. Recognition, maybe. The look of someone watching a thing they always knew was real being confirmed real by external, official sources. "What's happening?" Harry asked, directing it at Kingsley. "We're executing a DMLE warrant," Kingsley said. "Your uncle is being arrested and charged. The house is being documented for the legal record." He held Harry's gaze. "You don't have to stay in this room if you don't want to. Tonks is outside, Sheil, I want to stay," Harry said. Not defiant. Just clear. He moved to stand by the doorway, not in the room but visible from it, and crossed his arms, and watched. Vernon had found his bluster again in the way that men like him do when they have an audience and a target. He turned on Harry with the particular red-faced energy of someone who'd been getting away with things for decades and had just been told the bill had come due. "This is your doing, isn't it, going running to your lot, making up, Mr. Dursley. Kingsley stepped between them. Not dramatically. Just smoothly, efficiently, the way you close a door. He was taller than Vernon by 3 inches and he stood close enough that Vernon had to consciously choose not to step back. You will not speak to him right now. It was quiet enough in the room that the scratching of Calder's quill was audible. Vernon deflated. Not fully, men like Vernon never fully deflate, but the performance of outrage lost something essential when it ran into something that didn't move. Proudfoot, Kingsley said. Proudfoot came forward with the restraints, not handcuffs, exactly, but close enough that the visual was unmistakable, 2 loops of silvery cord that fastened around Vernon's thick wrists and hummed with a containment charm. They wouldn't hurt him. They wouldn't allow him to move farther than 10 feet from the nearest registered Auror. They were, Kingsley had always thought, the most honest thing in the Auror toolkit. They didn't pretend to be anything other than what they were. Vernon made a sound of profound outrage. These are ministry standard restraints, Proudfoot told him, with the flat professionalism of a man who had done this 1,000 times and could project calm the way a lighthouse projects light. They're not painful, they're not permanent, and if you cooperate with the documentation process, they can be removed while you're on the premises. Do you understand? Vernon looked at the restraints on his wrists. He looked at his wife, who had gone perfectly still on the sofa and was looking at the middle distance. He looked at Kingsley. He didn't say anything. But he stopped moving, which was acceptance of a sort. Petunia said, quietly, "What happens now?" "Calder's team will document the premises," Kingsley said. "That will take approximately 2 hours. Mr. Dursley will be transported to the ministry for formal processing and a holding interview. You are not currently being charged, Mrs. Dursley, but you are a witness and you will be required to provide a formal statement at a time to be arranged. Your son is not charged." He paused. "What happens to Harry is a separate matter that will be handled today." "Handled," Harry said, from the doorway. There was something in the word, not quite bitter, but aware. He'd been handled before. Kingsley looked at him. "Decided," he said. "With your input." "Not without it." Harry looked at him for a long moment. Then he nodded, once, and said nothing else. The documentation took 2 hours and 14 minutes. Calder moved through the house with the methodical thoroughness of someone who understood that the record she was building would matter in a room full of lawyers and judges, and she left nothing unnoted. She measured the cupboard under the stairs, still, even now, containing a small fold-out cot and a broken set of toy soldiers and a paperback so old the spine had cracked down the middle, and photographed the dimensions with a magical imager. She noted the locks on the outside of the door. She documented the kitchen pantry, where Harry's designated shelf contained approximately a quarter of what the surrounding shelves held. She noted the bedroom, technically Harry's current room, a significant upgrade from the cupboard, but noted also the locks on the outside of that door, and the flap at the bottom clearly designed for sliding food trays through, and the bars on the window that had, she was told by a visibly uncomfortable Petunia, been installed when Harry was 12. She wrote all of it down. Harry sat in the kitchen and drank a cup of tea that Tonks made him, and Kingsley sat across the table from him because someone should, and for a while neither of them said much. Harry had the particular silence of someone who had been talked at for most of their life and was therefore not entirely sure what to do when someone was simply present without an agenda. "You said you took a statement 2 weeks ago," Harry said eventually. "How'd you do that without me knowing?" "I didn't," Kingsley said. "I went to Hogwarts and spoke with Professor McGonagall and asked her to facilitate a formal interview. She was," he added, with a slight pause, "extremely cooperative." Something that might have been the beginning of a smile crossed Harry's face. "Bet she was. She had a fair amount to say herself, actually. I had to ask her to keep it out of the official record because she got fairly specific about what she'd like done with your uncle, and that kind of language doesn't scan well in ministry documentation." Harry looked at him with an expression that had considerably more life in it than the one he'd worn 30 minutes ago. "She didn't." "She absolutely did." She suggested, Kingsley said gravely, a curse that I believe was invented in the 14th century and hasn't been legally performed since. Harry laughed. It was short and surprised and clearly something he hadn't expected to do today, and Kingsley filed that away too, the way the laughter came out of him like he'd caught himself off guard with it. Why now? Harry said, the laughter gone but the slightly lighter quality of his face remaining. I've been here 4 summers. Why this one? Kingsley turned his mug between his hands. Outside, he could hear Calder moving through the upstairs hallway, heard the soft click of the imager. Because this summer, Voldemort came back, he said, directly, watching Harry's face and seeing it go steady and serious the way it apparently did when things got real. And that means you're a target the way you weren't before, not a prophetic future target, an active, immediate one. Putting a child who is actively wanted by the most dangerous dark wizard in a century in a house with people who resent him and have demonstrated they can't be trusted to keep him safe is not a security strategy. It is a gamble with someone else's life, and I don't gamble with children's lives. He let that land. The protection Dumbledore put on this house is real. But it's not the only protection available, and it comes at a cost that was never explicitly agreed to. Harry was quiet for a moment. Dumbledore knows you're doing this? He will by morning. Kingsley met his eyes. I didn't ask for his permission. The look Harry gave him then was hard to describe precisely. It had something of gratitude in it, and something of something older than gratitude, the recognition of a principle, maybe. The recognition that someone had decided his well-being was more important than their relationship with Albus Dumbledore, and had acted accordingly, without fanfare, at 6 in the morning on a Tuesday. Okay, Harry said. Okay? Yeah. He wrapped his hands around his mug. Okay. Vernon was transferred at 7:40 a.m. He was walked out the front door of number 4, Privet Drive in silver restraints with 2 Aurors at his flanks, and he was walked to a ministry transport that had operated into the drive in the form of a perfectly ordinary-looking dark blue van, and the moment he stepped off the property Kingsley made sure to disillusion the restraints so that the neighbors, already beginning to appear at their windows with the curtain-twitching curiosity of people who have been wondering about number 4 for years, could see clearly that a very large man in a dressing gown was being taken away in official custody. He allowed himself that small satisfaction. Petunia watched from the front step. She was very still. Kingsley noticed she didn't call after Vernon, didn't protest, didn't do any of the things that people sometimes do when they're watching something get taken from them. She watched like a woman watching a consequence arrive. Harry was standing behind her, in the hallway, and when Vernon's red face disappeared into the van, something in Harry's shoulders dropped. Not dramatically. Not visibly to anyone who wasn't looking. But Kingsley was looking, and he saw it, 3/4 of an inch of tension leaving a body that had been carrying it for so long it had probably stopped registering as tension and just registered as the shape of things. Kingsley came back up the front path and stood in front of Petunia. She looked at him with her sharp, pale face and her hands twisted together, and for a moment she looked very much like a woman who was waiting to be told something she'd always known was coming. You're not being charged today, Kingsley said. But this isn't finished. There will be a formal statement process and a tribunal, and you will be required to cooperate with that fully. Do you understand? Yes, she said. She glanced past him, toward the van, toward where it had been. What about Harry? Harry comes with me, Kingsley said. We have a safe house. He'll be comfortable, he'll be informed of everything that's happening, and he'll have the opportunity to communicate with, he stopped. Reframed it. He'll have a say in what comes next. Petunia looked at Harry, properly, directly, in a way that she possibly hadn't done in years. Harry looked back at her. Whatever passed between them in that moment wasn't forgiveness, it was too complicated and too raw for that, but it was something. An acknowledgement, maybe. The recognition of a shared history, however painful, and the fact that they'd both been shaped by things neither of them had chosen. He likes, she stopped. Started again, with some visible effort. He likes shepherd's pie. If anyone's feeding him. Harry looked startled. Kingsley nodded. I'll pass it on. She went back inside and closed the door, and Kingsley turned to Harry, who was looking at the closed door with an expression that was too complicated to parse. Ready? Kingsley said. Harry picked up the bag that Tonks had quietly packed for him, Tonks, who had gone through his room with the careful, cheerful efficiency of someone who understood instinctively what it meant to gather the belongings of a child who'd never had quite enough space for them, and slung it over his shoulder. Yeah, he said. Let's go. The safe house was in Wiltshire, a low stone farmhouse at the end of a lane that didn't appear on any Muggle map and which introduced itself to the magical senses as something warm and substantial and genuinely, solidly protected. Not Dumbledore's wards. Kingsley had commissioned these himself, from a ward-building specialist in Edinburgh, and they were designed not to keep someone in but to keep threats out, which was a philosophical difference that he considered important. Tonks dropped them there at 8:15 and operated back to the ministry to file the initial documentation. Proudfoot went with her. Calder stayed to complete a final walkthrough of the farm's existing wards, because that was the kind of person she was, and then she too was gone, leaving Kingsley and Harry in a stone kitchen that smelled of wood smoke and old timber and something warm baking, because Kingsley had arranged that too, had owed ahead to a ministry-contracted domestic service that was security-cleared and thorough and had left the kitchen stocked and the oven on. Harry stood in the middle of the kitchen and looked around at it with the expression of someone trying to decide how to feel about a place that was asking nothing of him. You can put your bag anywhere, Kingsley said. There are 3 bedrooms upstairs. Take whichever you want. Any of them? Any of them. Harry looked like this was an unexpectedly complex decision. He went upstairs slowly, and Kingsley heard footsteps moving from room to room, not frantic, just careful, the sound of someone taking up space thoughtfully, like they were checking they were allowed to, and then one door closed, gently, and the footsteps stopped. Kingsley put the kettle on. He was halfway through his own tea when his fireplace flared brilliant green and a face appeared in it that was neither unexpected nor entirely welcome at this precise moment. Kingsley, said Albus Dumbledore. Albus, said Kingsley. He didn't get up. The face in the fire was composed, as it always was. But Kingsley had known Dumbledore for 20 years and he could see, under the composure, a particular kind of unsettled, the look of a man who has found that a plan he considered fixed has been moved while his back was turned. I understand, Dumbledore said carefully, that there's been some activity this morning at Privet Drive. There has, Kingsley said. Vernon Dursley was arrested at 5:52 a.m. under a DMLE warrant and transported to ministry custody. Harry is here with me. He's fine. He paused. He's better than he was. A silence. The fire crackled. You might have consulted me, Dumbledore said. I consulted 3 senior Aurors and a head of division, Kingsley said pleasantly. I consulted Arabella Figg. I consulted the documented evidence, which is considerable. He set down his mug. What I determined, Albus, was that this wasn't a decision that required your consultation, because it wasn't about your plan. It was about the law. And the law says a child cannot be left in that house. Another silence, longer this time. The blood protections are not the only option available, and you know that. Kingsley's voice was still even, but under it was something that didn't waver. There are other ways to protect him. There are ways to protect him that don't require leaving him with people who put locks on his bedroom door. Kingsley, he had bars on his window, Albus. He said it quietly. Bars. On the window of a 12-year-old child. The fire was very quiet for a long moment. I am aware, Dumbledore said softly, that the situation was not ideal. Not ideal, Kingsley repeated. He let the words sit. He didn't need to dress them up. No. I suppose it wasn't. He picked up his tea. I think you should come here this afternoon. I think you and I should talk, and I think Harry should be part of that conversation this time. Not told about it afterwards. In it. Dumbledore's face was unreadable in the green fire. Then, I'll be there at 2. Good, Kingsley said. I'll have shepherd's pie. He ended the flu connection and sat in the quiet kitchen and listened to the distant sound of a door opening upstairs, and footsteps on the landing, and then Harry's voice, slightly muffled, saying, "Actually a pretty decent view from up here," to apparently no one, in the tone of someone who is discovering something small and good and is practicing the act of noticing it. Kingsley looked at the ceiling and permitted himself, very briefly, to feel something. Not quite satisfaction. Something quieter than that. The sense of a thing having been done that needed to be done, which was different from a victory, and more honest. Then he took out his notes, and began drafting the formal report, and got back to work. Harry came downstairs at 8:45, hair damp. He'd found the shower, apparently, and used it, and come out looking marginally less like someone who just watched his uncle be carted off in restraints at 6 in the morning, though the look was still there underneath. He was wearing different clothes, still too large but less so, and he sat at the kitchen table and looked at the breakfast that Kingsley had laid out with the expression of someone who was trying to decide whether it was polite to eat it or polite to wait. "Eat," Kingsley said, without looking up from his notes. Harry ate. Properly, actually, in the way of someone who hadn't done enough of it, and Kingsley noted it without commenting because commenting would have made it about something it didn't need to be about right now. It just needed to happen. They sat in easy quiet for a few minutes, the kind of quiet that means nobody needs to fill it. Outside the kitchen window, the July fields were beginning to warm up, the morning light turning from gray to gold across the grass, and somewhere out there the wizarding world was going about its collective business, largely unaware that something had shifted this morning, quietly and irrevocably, at a house on Privet Drive. "What happens next?" Harry asked. He'd finished eating. He'd poured himself more tea without being asked, which Kingsley took as a good sign. "This afternoon, Dumbledore comes here," Kingsley said. "We talk. All of us." He looked up. "After that, we figure out where you go, what legal protections we put in place, and how we handle the tribunal. That's probably 2 weeks away." Harry turned his mug around. "And then?" "And then," Kingsley said, "we deal with the war." He said it plainly, without dressing it up, because Harry was 15 and had already been in that graveyard and had already been briefed by reality in a way that Kingsley's gentleness wasn't going to undo. But not right this second. Right this second you can sit in a kitchen and have breakfast and not be told to do anything by anyone. Harry looked at him. "You're very direct," he said. "Not a complaint." "Generally," Kingsley agreed. "I think I like it." "Good," Kingsley said. "Because it doesn't particularly change either way." Harry smiled at that, properly, and it transformed his face in a way that suggested the face that lived under the wariness was a good face, a genuine one, the face of a person who, under the right circumstances, could be easy to know. Kingsley went back to his notes. Harry refilled his tea and looked out the window at the morning, and said nothing, and it was enough. Chapter 2. The statement. The formal interview room at the safe house was, by ministry standards, almost aggressively comfortable, 2 armchairs angled toward each other, a low table with water and tea, morning light coming through a window that looked out on nothing more threatening than a field of unhurried sheep. Kingsley had specifically requested this configuration when he'd commissioned the safe house. He'd sat in enough ministry interrogation rooms to know that the architecture of a room tells the person inside it what they are: suspect, subject, problem, and he'd wanted this room to say something different. Calder arrived at 9:30 with her documentation kit and her charmed quill and a leather portfolio that she set on the table with the care of someone who understood that everything in it mattered. She had changed out of her field robes into something quieter, dark trousers, a plain jacket, and she poured herself tea before she sat down, which Kingsley had noticed she always did, and which he'd long since identified as her way of making a space feel like a place she actually belonged rather than a location she'd been deployed to. Harry came in from the kitchen with a second cup of tea and stopped in the doorway. He looked at the armchairs, at Calder, at the quill, and something in his expression sharpened with the particular wariness of someone who has been in official processes before and found them unpleasant. "This is Auror Calder," Kingsley said, from the chair closest to the window. "She handles documentation for child welfare cases in the DMLE. She's going to take your statement today." "My statement," Harry said. "Yes. Which means you talk, she listens, the quill records, and nothing you say leaves this room without your explicit permission except as required for the legal case, which you'll be briefed on fully before anything is submitted." He gestured at the empty armchair. "Sit down, Harry. There's no wrong answers and there's no rush. If you want to stop, you stop." Harry sat. He looked at the quill, which was sitting inert, and then at Calder, who was looking back at him with the direct, uncomplicated attention of someone who had learned to make eye contact without making it feel like an examination. "I've read your school records," she said. "And Fig's deposition. And Kingsley's case notes." She said it matter-of-factly, not like she was laying out credentials but like she was acknowledging that she wasn't starting from zero, that he didn't have to explain the whole world before they got to anything useful. "But I'd rather hear it from you. In your words, in whatever order makes sense." She picked up her tea. "Where do you want to start?" Harry looked at the window for a moment. Then he said, "The cupboard, probably. That's where most of it starts." Calder nodded. The quill began to move. He talked for 2 hours. Not continuously, there were pauses, redirections, moments where Calder asked something specific and Harry answered with the blunt economy of someone who had decided to be precise rather than sparing, because if he was going to do this he was going to do it properly. He talked about the cupboard under the stairs, which had been his bedroom until he was 11 and which he described not with bitterness but with the flat, factual accuracy of someone recounting geography. He talked about the food, or the calibrated shortage of it, and the way Dudley's cast-off clothes had been his only wardrobe until Hogwarts. He talked about being told his parents had died in a car crash and that he wasn't to ask questions about them, and about the first time he'd seen a photograph of James and Lily Potter and understood, on some cellular level, that he'd been deliberately kept from something that belonged to him. He talked about Hogwarts with a different kind of energy, not relief, exactly, though it was there, but something more complicated, the love of a person for the first place that ever felt like home, undercut by the knowledge that even Hogwarts had not been entirely safe, and that the danger had been real and consistent and treated by the adults around him with a mixture of concern and baffling inaction. Calder didn't visibly react to any of it. She asked questions when she needed precision. "When you say he came after you in the car, can you describe what happened?" And she didn't ask the questions that weren't relevant, and she didn't offer the automatic reassurances that Kingsley had noticed some interviewers used as a kind of emotional spackling, filling the silences with "that must have been so hard" so that they didn't have to just sit with what they'd been told. Kingsley watched Harry talk. He wasn't the interviewer today, he was the observer, the senior officer, the person in the room whose job it was to notice everything that didn't make it into the transcript. He noticed the way Harry's posture changed when he talked about different things, loose and almost wry about the cupboard, which he'd long since processed, tighter about certain specific incidents, and entirely, oddly still when he talked about the graveyard. Because they got there eventually. Of course they did. "We're going to come to the Triwizard Tournament," Calder said, about 90 minutes in. She said it straightforwardly, not like it was a turn she was nervous about making. "That's a separate matter from the Dursley case, technically, but Kingsley believes, and I agree, that a full statement today is more useful than a partial one. Are you okay to cover it?" Harry nodded. He'd been expecting it. "Yeah. Tell me about the night of the third task." Harry told her. He told her about the cup, the portkey, the graveyard. He told her about Pettigrew, about the cauldron, about the way Voldemort had stepped out of it with the specific and terrible completeness of something that should not be and is anyway. He told her about the Death Eaters who gathered in that graveyard and named them, the ones he'd recognized, Lucius Malfoy, Crabbe Sr., Goyle Sr., McNair, with the same flat precision he'd used for everything else. He described the killing curse so specifically that Calder's quill slowed slightly, like even a charmed piece of enchanted equipment needed a moment, and then caught up. He told her about Cedric. This was different. This was the one place where the flat, factual tone cracked, not dramatically, not into weeping, but into something quieter and harder to look at. The precise flatness became precise silence, gaps between sentences that were doing work, and Kingsley could see him choosing each word the way you choose footholds on uncertain ground. He asked me to bring his body back, Harry said. Cedric did. Before, at the start, in the graveyard, when we first landed, he asked me to bring him back to his parents if I could. He was looking at the table. I did. I had to pull him back to the cup with me and he weighed more than I expected. He stopped. I don't know why I remember that part specifically. That he was heavier than I thought. Calder was quiet for a moment. Then she said, gently but directly, because it was real. That's why. Harry looked up at her. He nodded. Right, he said. Yeah. Kingsley looked out the window at the field, at the sheep moving with absolute bovine unconcern through the morning, and he thought about Cedric Diggory's parents, and about a ministry that had spent the last month doing everything in its considerable institutional power to suggest that Harry Potter was a liar, and he felt the thing that lived underneath his professional calm, not quite anger, but its more durable cousin. Stir and settle and stay. Thank you, Calder said to Harry, when he'd finished. All of it. I know that wasn't easy. She said it like a fact, not a performance. This statement is going to matter. Not just for the Dursley case. For everything. If anyone believes it, Harry said, not quite bitter, just practical. He'd had a month of the prophet already. Some people won't, Calder said. Some people will. Right now we're building the record, and the record doesn't care who believes it, it just needs to exist. She capped her pen. I'll have a transcription ready for your review by this evening. Harry nodded. He looked slightly drained, in the way of someone who has said a large and true thing out loud and is waiting to see what the air does with it. He refilled his tea from the pot on the table, and then he said, a little unexpectedly, who are the 3 Aurors who signed the warrant? Proudfoot, Savage, and Williamson, Kingsley said. I don't know Williamson. He knew your father, Kingsley said. Harry absorbed that. Is that why he signed? It's why he signed so hard he nearly put his fist through the parchment, Kingsley said. But it's not why I asked him. I asked him because he's fair and he's one of the most respected signatures in the building. The warrant needed to be unimpeachable. He looked at Harry. Everything about this needs to be unimpeachable. Because people are going to try to tear it apart. Fudge, Harry said. Among others. Harry nodded slowly. He looked like he was turning something over in his mind, some internal recalibration. Kingsley had noticed this about him, the way he processed things not with noise but with stillness, going quiet when something landed instead of filling the space around it. It was a trait more common in people who'd spent a lot of time in environments where noise had consequences. Kingsley recognized it because he'd seen it before, in debriefs with people who'd been in bad places for long periods, and what he'd learned was that the silence wasn't absence, it was thickness. It was a lot of processing happening very fast with very little showing. All right, Harry said, at last. So what do we do about Fudge? Kingsley almost smiled. That, he said, is exactly the right question. Sirius arrived at 11:15, and he arrived the way Sirius Black generally arrived, without warning, through the flue, trailing warmth and the slightly windswept energy of a man who had spent several years as a fugitive and had never entirely shed the habit of moving like someone who might need to leave quickly. He stepped out of the fireplace, saw Kingsley, said, "Where is he?" and didn't wait for the answer because Harry was already in the hallway, having heard the distinctive crash of someone coming through a flue connection with slightly too much speed. What happened next was not subtle. Sirius crossed the distance between the fireplace and Harry in about 4 strides and pulled him into a hug that had approximately 3 years of missed birthdays and 2 years of near misses and 1 graveyard and a boy he was not going to lose, not like this, not like James, not while he still had a functional body to put between Harry and anything trying to reach him. All of that was in the hug, compressed into about 6 seconds of physical contact, and Harry hugged him back with both arms. And the kind of unself-consciousness that only existed when you didn't have an audience you were performing for. Kingsley looked at Calder. Calder looked at her notes. They gave it a moment. "You're all right," Sirius said. It wasn't a question. It was the kind of statement you make to anchor yourself. "I'm all right," Harry said, his voice slightly muffled. "He arrested Vernon." "I know, I was there." Sirius pulled back and looked at Harry the way people look at things they've been frightened for, not quickly but in pieces, reassembling a picture. He looked at the too large t-shirt and something flickered in his eyes. He looked at the spellotape on Harry's glasses. Another flicker, this one sharper. "I'm going to get you new glasses," he said. "They work fine." "That's not the point." He turned to Kingsley with the particular energy of a man who has been handed hope after a long drought and doesn't yet know what to do with his hands. "How did it go? Tell me everything. Start from when you got to the street." Kingsley told him. Not everything, not the parts that were Harry's to tell in his own time, but the warrant, the arrest, the documentation, the flu call from Dumbledore. Sirius listened with his arms folded and his jaw tightening incrementally, and by the time Kingsley got to the 3 locks on the front door and the bars on the bedroom window and the flap at the bottom of the door, Sirius had stopped looking at Kingsley and was looking at the wall behind him with the controlled expression of a man containing something at considerable effort. "The cupboard," Sirius said. "It wasn't a question either." "Documented," Kingsley said. "Dimensioned, photographed, itemized. The fold-out cot is still in there. Calder's team sealed it as physical evidence." Sirius said something extremely specific about Vernon Dursley that technically constituted a threat and which Kingsley chose to hear as rhetorical, because Sirius was not actually going to do it, but the sentiment was architecturally sound. "Sirius," Harry said. Sirius looked at him. "He's in ministry custody. He's not getting out of this." He said it with a certainty that was, Kingsley noted, new, not performed confidence but the real thing, the security of someone who had watched a thing happen with their own eyes and had filed it as confirmed reality. Let Kingsley do his job. Sirius looked at him for a long moment. "When did you get sensible?" "About 6 this morning." Sirius made a sound that was halfway between a laugh and something that wasn't, sat down in one of the kitchen chairs, and put his head in his hands for exactly 10 seconds. Then he came back up and said, "Right. What do we need to do?" The afternoon had the particular quality of a held breath. They ate lunch. Kingsley had transfigured the available ingredients into something more substantial than sandwiches, and then Harry went upstairs for an hour, and Kingsley used the time to send encrypted Patronus messages to Proudfoot and Williamson about the afternoon's meeting, and to speak briefly to Calder, who had stayed to complete the statement transcription and who found him in the garden. "He's credible," she said, without preamble. "I know. Not just credible, he's exceptional. As a witness." She had her portfolio tucked under her arm and was looking at the field with an expression that suggested she was choosing her words deliberately. "He doesn't exaggerate. He doesn't dramatize. He corrects himself when he's not sure of something. When he doesn't know a detail, he says he doesn't know rather than filling it in." She turned to Kingsley. "Do you know how rare that is in a witness who's been through something traumatic? Most people either minimize or embellish. He just reports." "He's been surrounded by people who doubted him for most of his life," Kingsley said. "He learned to be precise because imprecision gave people room to dismiss him." Calder was quiet for a moment. "That's a miserable way to learn a useful skill." "Yes," Kingsley agreed. "The graveyard testimony alone," she stopped. Looked at him directly. "Kingsley, if that statement gets in front of the right people, combined with the physical evidence from the night of the third task, and the testimony of the other champions, I know Fudge is going to fight this. I know. She looked at him steadily. Are you ready for what that looks like? Kingsley looked at the farmhouse, at the windows, at the ordinary, unremarkable shape of a safe place that he had spent 6 weeks building towards for a specific 15-year-old who had never had one before. He thought about Fudge's office, and Fudge's allies on the Wisengamot, and the Prophet, and all the institutional weight of a ministry that had decided the most convenient thing to believe was nothing. Cornelius Fudge, he said, signed off on the Dementor presence at Hogwarts in Harry's 3rd year without full disclosure to the Board of Governors. He authorized the illegal use of a ministry-controlled creature on school premises. He personally pressured Dumbledore to suppress the Triwizard Inquest. He obstructed 3 separate DMLE reports that referenced increased Death Eater activity last year. He turned to Calder. I've been ready for Fudge since March. I was just waiting for the right case. Calder looked at him for a moment. Then she nodded once, with the satisfaction of someone who has just confirmed a suspicion they'd been carrying for a while. Good, she said. Then let's go in. It's nearly 2. Dumbledore came through the flue at 2:01, which for Albus Dumbledore was either deliberately significant or punctual depending on your level of generosity. He was in robes of deep blue and he carried his wand in its habitual place at his side, and he entered the room with the specific energy of someone who is very powerful and very used to being the most important person present and who is, just this once, not entirely certain that that's the case. Harry was sitting in the armchair by the window. He hadn't moved when the fire flared. He was watching Dumbledore with an expression that Kingsley couldn't entirely read, not hostile, not deferential, somewhere between the two in a territory that had its own name, something like waiting. Sirius, who had also stayed, was standing by the fireplace from which Dumbledore had just emerged, which Kingsley suspected was deliberate. Sirius was not a subtle man in most respects, but he was occasionally precise about spatial positioning. Harry, Dumbledore said. His voice was warm, as it always was. I'm very glad to see you looking well. I'm all right, Harry said. Thank you for coming. It was polite. Correctly, carefully polite. The politeness of someone who has decided to be measured. Dumbledore turned to Kingsley. His eyes, behind the half-moon glasses, were doing several things at once in the way that Albus Dumbledore's eyes generally did. Kingsley. I think you and I have something to discuss. We do, Kingsley agreed. Sit down, Albus. The slight pause before Dumbledore sat was less than a second. No one who wasn't paying attention would have caught it. Kingsley caught it. I want to say first, Dumbledore began, that I understand your concerns, and that I recognize, I'd actually like to start somewhere else, Kingsley said. He said it without apology, without aggression, just the clarity of a man redirecting a conversation toward the point. I'd like to start with Harry. Dumbledore looked at Harry. Harry looked at Dumbledore. Harry, Kingsley said, you've had about 5 hours now. Is there anything you want to say to Dumbledore directly? About any of it. The Dursleys, the tournament, the summer, anything. The room was very quiet. Outside, a cloud moved over the sun and the quality of light through the window shifted, turned briefly grayer, then came back. Harry took a breath. Why did you send me back there, he said. This summer. After everything. You knew what it was like. You had to have known. Dumbledore was quiet for a moment. Not composing his answer, Kingsley thought. Actually feeling the weight of the question. The blood protection that your mother's sacrifice created, he said carefully, is one of the most powerful magical barriers that, I know about the blood protection, Harry said. McGonagall explained it in 2nd year. I'm not asking about the magic. I'm asking why you decided that was worth that. He didn't gesture wildly. He just said that, precisely, and the word landed with the weight of everything Calder had documented that morning. Silence. Because, Dumbledore said, and then he stopped, and Kingsley watched him do something he had seen Albus Dumbledore do perhaps twice in 20 years, he set down whatever he had been about to say and picked up the truth instead. Because I made a calculation, he said. I weighed your safety against your comfort and I chose your safety. And I did not give sufficient weight to the question of whether those two things are as separable as I assumed. He looked at Harry over his glasses. I was wrong to treat them as though they were. Harry looked at him. He looked at him for long enough that the silence became substantial. Okay, he said at last. That's all you want to say? Sirius said, with the forced restraint of a man gripping himself very firmly by the collar. For now, Harry said. He was looking at Dumbledore still, and Kingsley could see him processing something, some internal accounting. For now it's enough. Dumbledore held his gaze. Something in his expression, under the composure, was raw in the way of old wounds that have been touched. You are more generous than I deserve, he said, quietly. Maybe, Harry said. But I'm also not going back there. No, Dumbledore said. You are not. The tactical discussion that followed was where the afternoon got interesting. Kingsley laid out the DMLE case, the timeline, the tribunal date, and the political landscape with the precision of someone who had spent months building this and knew every load-bearing wall. Dumbledore listened, occasionally asked questions that were exactly the right questions in the way that his questions always were, and at no point attempted to dismantle what Kingsley had built, which told Kingsley that even Albus Dumbledore could recognize when something was structurally sound. Fudge is the problem, Sirius said. He'd stopped standing by the fireplace and had eventually sat on the arm of Harry's chair in the unconscious, instinctive way of someone putting themselves physically adjacent to the person they were most concerned about. He's going to use the tribunal to make it about Harry's credibility instead of about Vernon Dursley. That's the plan, Kingsley said. Yes. So how do we stop him? We don't stop him trying, Kingsley said. We make sure that when he tries, it doesn't work. He spread his notes on the table. The Dursley case stands entirely on its own evidence, the physical record, the medical documentation, Fig's testimony. It doesn't require Harry's graveyard testimony to function. Fudge will try to conflate the two cases, make them look like a coordinated attack on the Ministry. Our job is to keep them clearly separate while making sure the graveyard testimony gets formally entered into the DMLE record as a separate matter, one that can't be quietly shelved, because it's attached to an active welfare case. Dumbledore was looking at the notes on the table. You're using the child protection case as a vehicle, he said. I'm using the child protection case as itself, Kingsley said. And I'm making sure that everything Harry witnessed in that graveyard is attached to it as context, because it is context. His safety this summer, the reason he needs protection beyond a blood ward, is directly connected to the fact that Voldemort is back and specifically wants him dead. That's not a political statement. It's a protective custody justification. It's elegant, Dumbledore said, with something in his voice that wasn't quite approval. It was the sound of a man who has spent decades as the most strategically minded person in any room and has just found someone thinking 3 moves ahead of where he expected. It's necessary, Kingsley said. They're the same thing, sometimes, Sirius said, which was surprisingly perceptive for someone currently eating the last of the biscuits. Harry had been listening to all of this with his elbows on his knees and his hands loosely clasped, and now he looked up and said, "Can I testify? At the tribunal?" Kingsley looked at him. "You can. I was going to discuss whether you should." "I should," Harry said simply. "If Fudge tries to use it as an opportunity to discredit me, then not being there is the same as letting him. And if I'm there," he looked at Kingsley steadily. "If I'm there and I say exactly what I saw, exactly how I saw it, the way I told Calder this morning, then anyone who wants to call me a liar has to do it to my face." Sirius made a sound of complicated pride. Kingsley looked at Harry and thought about the boy who had appeared in the doorway of that sitting room at 6 in the morning, thin and carefully quiet and not yet sure he was allowed to take up space. That had been 8 hours ago. Something in the 8 hours had changed, not fundamentally, it was the same person, but the posture of it had shifted, the angle at which he was engaging with things. Like someone had confirmed for him that the ground was actually there, and so now he could stand on it properly. "Yes," Kingsley said. "You can testify." Dumbledore looked at Harry with an expression that had several layers to it. At the bottom, under the strategy and the careful weighing and the decades of complicated wisdom, was something that looked remarkably like relief. Like watching a person you've been worrying about quietly for years begin to be all right. "I had intended," Dumbledore said carefully, "to brief you on the Order of the Phoenix at some point this summer. I recognize that some of what I have decided on your behalf has not." "Tell me now," Harry said. Dumbledore blinked, which Kingsley was almost certain he'd never seen before. "Now? You were going to tell me at some point. Now seems fine." Harry looked at him with the same steady patience he'd been using all morning. "I'm not asking to be in charge of anything. I just want to know what's happening. It's my war too. Isn't it?" It was not really a question. Dumbledore looked at him for a long moment, and then he said, "Yes, Harry. I suppose it is." He told him. Not everything, some of it was operationally sensitive and Kingsley himself only knew pieces, but the core of it, the structure of the Order, the network, what they knew about Voldemort's current movements and what they suspected. Harry listened without interrupting. He asked 2 questions, both of them precise and relevant, one of which made Dumbledore pause appreciably before answering, and the other of which made Sirius look at him with the expression of a man watching someone become who they were always going to be. When it was done, Harry sat back and said, "Okay." "Okay?" Dumbledore said, with slight echo of Kingsley's own earlier response. "Okay," Harry said. "What do you need me to do?" After Dumbledore left, through the flue at 4:15, with a promise to send more complete Order briefings and a word to Kingsley that carried in it the specific weight of 2 men who respect each other and currently disagree about significant things and have decided to keep working together anyway, Sirius and Harry sat in the garden while the afternoon turned toward evening. Kingsley stayed inside, at the kitchen table, with his notes. Through the window he could see them, Sirius leaning against the stone wall, Harry sitting on it, both of them talking in the easy, sideways way of people who know each other well enough to let conversation meander. He could see the shapes of it without the words, the way Sirius talked with his hands when he was explaining something and the way Harry occasionally laughed, and it looked the same as it had in the kitchen that morning, startled out of him, like a good surprise. Calder appeared beside him with the completed transcript, a neat stack of parchment that she set on the table without ceremony. "It's good," she said. "It's very good. This is going to hold up." Kingsley looked at it. "Thank you," he said. "For how you handled this morning." She shrugged slightly. "He made it easy. Most people can't." She paused. "Most people who've been through what he's been through can't give a statement like that. It takes a long time, usually, before they can do that. He just sat down and told me the truth." "He's been telling the truth for 4 years, Kingsley said. "He's just never had anyone treat it like it mattered." Calder was quiet for a moment, looking out the window at the 2 figures in the garden. "He's going to be all right," she said. "Not as a professional assessment. Just as a person saying a true thing." "Yes," Kingsley said. "He is." He looked back at his notes and then, for a moment, just at the window. At the evening light over the field. At Harry Potter sitting on a garden wall and talking to his godfather and looking, fractionally, not completely, but genuinely and without pretense, like someone who had arrived somewhere after a very long walk and was only just beginning to understand that they were allowed to stop. The war was coming. It was already here, in a sense, in the graveyard that was in the transcript on the table, in the Lucius Malfoy who was currently going about his business in a manner somewhere while Fudge kept his seat on the Wizengamot, in the Death Eaters whose names Harry had recited with flat, methodical precision because he'd been close enough to see their faces and had had the presence of mind to memorize them. But it was evening, and the safe house was solid and warded and real, and in the kitchen a transcript sat that was going to matter, and outside two people who loved each other were having a conversation that had been interrupted by 13 years of terrible circumstance and were picking it back up without apology. Kingsley made another cup of tea. Added it to the running tally of things to do: follow up with Proudfoot, draft the tribunal preparation schedule, contact Williamson about Fudge's likely countermove, arrange new glasses for Harry before the week was out. And under all of that, quiet but there, keep building this. Whatever this was, a case, a strategy, a life being reconstructed from better materials. Keep building it. Don't stop. He started on the next page of notes. Outside, Harry laughed at something Sirius said, and the sound of it came through the open window and into the kitchen and sat there comfortably, uncomplicated, taking up exactly the right amount of room. Chapter 3, Fault Lines. The owl came at 7 in the morning, 2 days after the raid, and it wasn't subtle about it. It was a ministry bird, the large, self-important kind with the red leg band that meant official correspondence, and it arrived with the energy of something that had been sent in a hurry and told not to wait for a response. It dropped a sealed envelope on the kitchen table, ruffled itself at Kingsley in a way that suggested it had opinions about early mornings, and left without touching the offered treats. Kingsley picked up the envelope. The seal was Cornelius Fudge's personal crest, not the ministry's official mark but Fudge's own, which meant this was not a departmental communication. This was personal. He opened it. It was 4 paragraphs. Dense, careful prose in Fudge's slightly overwrought style, each sentence doing the work of 3. The first paragraph expressed grave concern about the unilateral actions of a senior DMLE officer. The second raised the question of jurisdiction, specifically whether a warrant relating to the treatment of a magical minor by Muggle custodians fell under DMLE purview or required ministerial approval. The third suggested, with the particular delicacy of someone putting their hand on a throat, that the timing of this action, so soon after the Triwizard Tournament and its attendant confusion, raised questions about the political motivations of the officer concerned. The fourth paragraph requested Kingsley's presence at a private meeting at the ministry at his earliest convenience. Kingsley read it twice. Then he folded it carefully, put it in his breast pocket, and went to make breakfast. Harry came down 20 minutes later looking considerably more rested than he had 48 hours ago. He was still thin, still wearing glasses with spellotape on the bridge, but his eyes were clearer and his posture had the quality of someone who had slept somewhere that didn't require hypervigilance. He sat at the table and reached for the toast and said, without looking up, "Something's happened." "Fudge sent an owl," Kingsley said. "What does he want?" "A meeting. He's also questioning the warrant's jurisdiction." Harry looked up at that. "Can he do that? Make the warrant invalid?" "He can try," Kingsley said. "He won't succeed. The warrant was signed under subsection 7 of the Magical Minors Protection Act, which predates the current ministerial oversight structure by 60 years. It doesn't require his signature or his knowledge. He knows that." He put a plate in front of Harry. "He's not trying to invalidate the warrant. He's trying to intimidate me into slowing down." "Will it work?" Harry said, with the tone of someone who already knew the answer but wanted to hear it confirmed. "No," Kingsley said. Harry ate his toast. "Good." Sirius arrived at 8:30 with a package under his arm and the look of someone who had been up since before dawn doing something that had required considerable restraint to not do at 3 in the morning instead. He dropped the package on the table in front of Harry. "Open it." Harry looked at the package. It was wrapped in plain brown paper and roughly the size of a shoebox, and it had been sealed with a charm that Kingsley recognized as a commercial wrapping spell from a specific shop in Diagon Alley. The kind of shop that stayed open late and didn't ask many questions. Harry opened it. Inside, wrapped in a soft cloth, were a pair of glasses. Not spellotaped, not secondhand, not the round NHS frames he'd been wearing since he was old enough to have a prescription. These were new, properly fitted. Sirius had apparently oiled the prescription ahead, and the frames were a slightly darker metal than his usual, and they sat on Harry's face when he put them on like something that had been made for him, which was because they had been. Harry looked at Sirius through the new glasses. Sirius was doing the thing where he was very carefully not making it into a moment, keeping his expression casual in the studied way of someone who feels something sharply and has decided the other person doesn't need to manage that right now. "Better?" he said. "Yeah," Harry said. He touched the frame, just briefly. "Thanks." "The other pair was embarrassing me," Sirius said, and sat down and stole a piece of toast, and that was that. Kingsley watched this and said nothing, because nothing needed to be said. He filed the image away in the part of his mind where he kept things that were worth keeping, and went back to his notes. He went to the ministry at 10. He didn't dress it up. He wore his Auror robes, formal ones, with the DMLE insignia visible, and his badge on a chain at his breast, and he walked through the atrium without stopping to talk to anyone, because stopping to talk to people in the atrium when you were about to go and have a difficult meeting with the minister was how you arrived to the difficult meeting having already lost something. Fudge's office was on the second floor, behind a secretary who had the look of someone who had spent years carefully calibrating their level of loyalty to a man they weren't entirely sure about. She showed Kingsley in with the brisk efficiency of someone not being paid to have opinions. Fudge was behind his desk, which was large and deliberately so, the kind of desk that says I am important in the same way that Privet Drive's lawn said I am normal. He was a round man in lime green robes, and he was wearing the expression of someone who had prepared a position and was now going to deliver it regardless of the weather. Percy Weasley was standing to the left of the desk with a clipboard and the upright posture of someone in the process of becoming something he wouldn't always be glad he became. He looked at Kingsley with the slightly desperate officiousness that Kingsley had come to associate with him, the look of a young man working very hard to be taken seriously by someone who was using him as furniture. Kingsley sat down without being invited to, which set the tone neatly. "Auror Shacklebolt," Fudge began. "Thank you for coming so promptly." "Of course," Kingsley said. "I'll be direct." Fudge leaned forward slightly, which was meant to project authority and instead projected anxiety. "The action you took 2 days ago at the Dursley residence was irregular." "It was lawful," Kingsley said. "Be that as it may, the warrant was signed by 3 senior Aurors under subsection 7 of the Magical Minors Protection Act," Kingsley said. He was not loud, not fast, just thorough. "The case file contains 4 years of documented evidence, a sworn deposition, school medical records, and a formal witness statement. The arrest was conducted properly, within ministry guidelines, and the subject is in DMLE custody pending tribunal." He looked at Fudge steadily. "Which part of that would you like to discuss?" Fudge's jaw moved slightly. He was recalibrating. "What concerns me," he said carefully, "is the timing. Given the current climate, and the questions being raised about Harry Potter is not the subject of this case," Kingsley said. "Vernon Dursley is. Nevertheless, Harry Potter is a witness and a victim in a child welfare matter," Kingsley said. "His testimony is part of a formal DMLE record. Anything that happens to that record is a matter for the department, not the minister's office." The room was quiet for a moment. Percy's quill had stopped moving. Fudge sat back. He was doing the thing powerful men do when they can't find the direct approach, circling, looking for a different angle. "Kingsley," he said, and his voice changed, went warmer, more collegial, which was the sign that the official posturing had failed and he was trying something else. "We've known each other a long time. I know you're a man of principle. I respect that enormously." He was leaning forward again, elbows on the desk, hands clasped. "But surely you can see, in the current climate, with the prophet asking questions about Potter's mental state, with the tournament still fresh, an action like this looks like a political move. It looks like someone is trying to lend credibility to a story that the ministry has determined is. The ministry has not formally determined anything," Kingsley said. "What the ministry has done is refrain from investigating, which is different." He held Fudge's gaze. I am not making a political move. I am doing my job, which is to protect magical minors and enforce the law. If that intersects inconveniently with a political problem you're managing, I'm sorry for the inconvenience. But I'm not going to stop. The warm collegial tone left Fudge's face like water from a tilted glass. Shacklebolt, he said, and the name came out flat and deliberate. You should think carefully about your position here. I've thought about it since March, Kingsley said, standing. I'm comfortable with it. He left without being dismissed, which was not how you were supposed to leave the minister's office, and which communicated everything that needed communicating without a single additional word. He was back at the safe house by noon. The moment he walked through the door he could feel something different in the air, not wrong, exactly, but changed, like the atmospheric pressure after something significant has happened indoors. He found Harry and Sirius in the sitting room and, unexpectedly, Remus Lupin in the armchair closest to the window, looking like someone who had been traveling and had just arrived at a destination he'd been making his way toward with some urgency. Lupin looked tired, but then Lupin usually looked tired, it was structurally part of his face by now, and he looked at Kingsley with the specific warmth of someone who was genuinely glad to see him. Kingsley. Remus, Kingsley said. When did you get here? About 20 minutes ago. Dumbledore sent me. He glanced at Harry. He thought, given the situation, it might be useful to have someone here who could brief Harry on the Order's current intelligence. Specifically regarding Voldemort's movements since June. Harry was sitting on the sofa with his knees pulled up and his arms resting on them, and he was looking at Lupin with an expression that was complicated in a specific way, the look of someone who loves someone and has been worried about them and is trying to decide whether to say that or just carry on with the business at hand. You look terrible, Harry said. He said it with the directness of someone who has decided that people who matter to him get honesty as a form of care. Lupin smiled. Summer has not been restful. Where have you been? Here and there, Lupin said. Dumbledore had me doing some groundwork, reaching out to certain communities who might be persuaded to side with us before Voldemort gets to them first. He didn't elaborate on which communities, and Kingsley noted the discretion without pressing it. I've been following your situation from a distance. I was glad to hear about Tuesday. Were you? Harry said. You didn't know it was happening either. The sentence landed with precise aim. Not viciously, Harry's voice was matter-of-fact, but it found its mark. Lupin held his gaze without flinching. No, he said. I didn't. That's something I should address. He looked at his hands for a moment. You've had a great many people making decisions around you for a long time, Harry. I've been one of them. I think Kingsley's approach this week has demonstrated why that model has problems. Yeah, Harry said. Not angry. Just acknowledging it. It does. I intend to do better, Lupin said simply. Harry looked at him for a moment, and the complicated expression resolved into something warmer and more straightforward. Okay, he said. Tell me about Voldemort's movements. Sirius made a sound. You realize most 15-year-olds would want to talk about something else. Most 15-year-olds weren't in the graveyard, Harry said. Nobody had anything to say to that. Lupin's briefing took an hour and it was thorough and it was delivered with the measured clarity of a man who had been an exceptional teacher and still was, regardless of what he was currently doing. He covered what the Order knew, and it was less than Kingsley would have liked. The intelligence was patchy and incomplete, the network that had existed in the First War had been rebuilt piecemeal and didn't yet have the density it needed. Voldemort was moving carefully. Recruiting quietly. Focusing on consolidation before any visible action, which was more concerning than immediate visible action because it suggested planning. Harry listened with the same focused stillness he'd brought to Calder's interview, asking specific questions at specific moments, not showing off that he was following, just following and speaking when something needed clarifying. He asked about Malfoy. He asked about the Death Eaters he'd seen in the graveyard and whether any of them had been brought in. He asked about Pettigrew, which made Sirius's expression do something complicated, and Lupin answered all of it without softening or deflecting. "They're not coming after me yet," Harry said, when Lupin had finished. "You said Voldemort is consolidating. Building strength. So his priority isn't me right now, it's making himself strong enough that when he does come for me, or whatever the prophecy requires." He stopped. "There is a prophecy, isn't there?" The room went very quiet. Lupin looked at Kingsley. Sirius looked at the window with the expression of a man who knew this was coming and had made his peace with it but still found the peace provisional. "That's a question for Dumbledore," Kingsley said carefully. "Dumbledore said he'd tell me things," Harry said. "He said I had a right to know what's happening." "So is there a prophecy?" "Yes," Sirius said, from the window. "Sirius," Lupin began. "He has a right to know," Sirius said, with the flat certainty of a man who has spent years watching the opposite approach produce catastrophic results. "He's been living inside this thing since he was a year old, and not knowing doesn't protect him, it just means he's walking around without a map." He turned to Harry. "There's a prophecy. It's in the Department of Mysteries. I don't know the exact wording, and neither does anyone in this room, only Dumbledore knows the full content. What I know is that it has to do with you and Voldemort, and the fact that one of you has to." He stopped. His jaw tightened. "Dumbledore needs to be the one to tell you the rest." Harry absorbed this. Kingsley watched him do it, watched him take the shape of it, the weight of it, and not buckle under the weight, just adjust. Like a tree in wind. Like someone who had been waiting for something heavy and now it had arrived, and it was, as he had suspected, heavy, but he'd known it was coming, and so it didn't take him off his feet. "Okay," Harry said. "I'm going to ask him." "You should," Sirius said. "I will." He looked around the room. "Today?" "I'll send a Patronus," Kingsley said. "He'll come." Dumbledore arrived at 3, and if he was surprised that Harry asked him about the prophecy before he'd fully stepped out of the fireplace, he didn't show it. He sat down, looked at Harry with the eyes that always seemed to be measuring something beyond the visible, and said, "I had planned to tell you this at a more considered. Now is fine," Harry said. "Please." Dumbledore told him. The full version, the one Kingsley himself had only partially known. Neither can live while the other survives. The words settled into the room with the weight of something that had been waiting a long time to be said to the right person. Harry sat very still for a long moment. Then he said, "So one of us has to kill the other." "In essence," Dumbledore said. His voice was very quiet. "And it's going to be me. That kills him." "Not a question. An assessment." "I believe so, yes." Harry looked at the fireplace for a moment. "How long have you known that?" "Since before you were born." "How long have you been planning around it without telling me?" Dumbledore did the thing he'd done in the farmhouse 2 days ago, set down the prepared answer and picked up the true one. "Since you came to Hogwarts," he said. Harry nodded slowly. The room was watching him, and he seemed to know it and to not particularly care, just occupied with the internal work of integrating something enormous. "All right," he said at last. "Then I need to be prepared. I need to actually be prepared, not protected away from everything until the moment I'm needed. I need to know what I'm doing." "Yes," Dumbledore said. "Private lessons. Real ones. Not just, I need to know dark magic, how it works, how to fight it and counter it. I need to know about Voldemort specifically, who he was, how he thinks, what his weaknesses are. All of it." "I had intended to arrange exactly that," Dumbledore said, with something that was not quite a smile but lived near one. "Beginning in September." "Beginning now," Harry said. "I have the summer." Dumbledore looked at him. Then he looked at Kingsley, a sideways look that Kingsley had learned to parse over the years, and this one said something like, "Well, then." "Beginning now," he agreed. Sirius said, "I want to be involved." Sirius, he's my godson, Sirius said. And I was an Auror trainee before everything went wrong, and I happen to know quite a bit about advanced defensive magic and dark counter curses, and if you think I'm going to sit in a farmhouse and play chess while Harry's being trained, you have a significantly wrong picture of what I'm willing to do. He said it without heat, without drama, just as a statement of fact, and Dumbledore looked at him for a moment with an expression that was complicated in ways Kingsley didn't try to unpick. Very well, Dumbledore said. I will arrange it. Lupin said, I'm available, simply, and that was that. The order fracture happened that evening, and it happened because Molly Weasley arrived. She came through the flue at 6:15 with the specific energy of a woman who has been told something by her husband that she feels strongly about, and who has come directly from that telling without taking time to let the feeling settle. Arthur came through after her with the expression of a man who has tried to suggest that perhaps this could wait until tomorrow and has not been heeded. Kingsley had been expecting this conversation. He'd been expecting it approximately since Monday morning, which was when Arthur had apparently told Molly about the raid, and he had hoped it would happen in a moment with slightly less collective emotional charge than this particular one, but here they were. Molly was a formidable woman, and Kingsley respected her enormously, and none of that changed the fact that she swept into the room and went directly to Harry and stood in front of him with her hands on his shoulders and looked at him from a distance of about 8 inches in a way that would have been alarming if you didn't know that she did this to all the people she was worried about. You look thin, she said. Hello, Mrs. Weasley, Harry said. You're always thin, but you look thinner. Are you eating? Kingsley makes breakfast, Harry said. Molly turned to Kingsley with the expression of a woman who has a thing to say and intends to say it clearly. I want him at the Burrow, she said. With his friends, with people around him, somewhere that isn't, she looked at the farmhouse. Somewhere that isn't a DMLE safe house like he's evidence. He's not, Kingsley began. I know what it is, Molly said. I know why it's necessary, and I think what you did on Tuesday was right. I told Arthur so. Arthur nodded confirmation from the corner, but he's 15 years old and he's been through a trauma and he needs his friends around him, not just, she gestured at the room, at Kingsley and Sirius and Lupin, and Kingsley understood that she wasn't disparaging anyone in it so much as observing that it was not, functionally, a home. He needs Ron and Hermione. He needs to not be sitting in a stone house in Wiltshire feeling like a case file. He's not a case file, Sirius said, and his voice had an edge. I know that, Sirius, Molly said, and her voice had an edge that matched his. I am not suggesting that anyone in this room thinks of him that way. I'm saying that a 15-year-old boy who has spent his life being managed by adults who mean well, she said mean well with the precision of someone who has thought about this carefully and is still being generous, might benefit from being somewhere that feels like normal life. The room was quiet. Harry said, I can speak. Molly looked at him. I know you can, love. I mean, I appreciate it, Harry said. The Burrow. I want that. I genuinely want that. He looked at Kingsley. But not until after the tribunal. I don't want to be somewhere that isn't secure until we know what Fudge is going to do. He looked at Molly. Is that, can you understand that? Molly looked at him for a moment, and the forceful energy she'd entered with shifted into something quieter. Yes, she said. Yes, I can understand that. She pulled him into a brief, fierce hug that Harry returned without hesitation, which told Kingsley something about the specific shape of Harry's relationship with physical affection. He didn't avoid it when it came from people he trusted, he was just careful about trusting. Arthur had quietly made his way to the kitchen and could be heard putting the kettle on, which was Arthur's solution to most things and, Kingsley reflected, not a bad one. The fracture came 20 minutes later, after the tea had been distributed and everyone was sitting down, when the flow went again and Mundungus Fletcher came through smelling of something that wasn't tobacco and carrying the expression of a man who had been asked to attend a meeting he suspected was going to require things of him. Harry looked at him. Who's this? Mundungus Fletcher, Kingsley said. Order member. What does he do? Kingsley paused, because the honest answer required some navigation. He has a broad range of contacts and a useful network of information sources. Mundungus Fletcher looked at Harry with the slightly calculating appraisal of someone assessing all angles simultaneously. "All right, Potter. Heard a lot about you. Pleasure." "Right," Harry said. "Dung is supposed to be part of your guard rotation," Sirius said, and his tone conveyed exactly what he thought of this. Dumbledore's arrangement. "I don't want him guarding anything," Harry said. Simply. Not rudely, just as a statement of preference. Mundungus looked affronted. "Oi, it's not personal," Harry said. I've got Kingsley, I've got Sirius, I've got Professor Lupin. No offense, but you don't add anything to that." "The boy's got a point," Sirius said. "Sirius," Molly said sharply. "He does though," Sirius said. "Dung spent 2 of his guard rotations last autumn." He stopped, glanced at Harry. "He's not reliable." Mundungus puffed up with the energy of someone who has been called unreliable in front of an audience and has decided the best response is volume. "I take personal offense to." "Enough," Kingsley said. It came out at the same volume as everything else he said, which was not loud, but it had the quality of a door closing and everyone in the room felt it. He looked at Mundungus. "You're not on the rotation here. I'll speak to Dumbledore about alternative assignments." He looked around the room. "Harry's security is handled. What I need from the Order right now is intelligence sharing, specifically anything related to Death Eater movement in the southeast, and I need it through proper channels, not through whoever happens to come through the flue." Mundungus left shortly thereafter with the poorly concealed relief of someone who had been let out of a situation earlier than expected. But the fracture that Kingsley had felt coming, that hairline crack in the Order's internal cohesion, had shown itself, and he'd seen it. The safe house wasn't neutral ground. It was his ground, DMLE ground, and several Order members who trusted Dumbledore implicitly were not yet sure what they thought about a move that had been made without him. They'd support it now that it was done, most of them. But support and trust weren't the same thing, and the coming weeks were going to require both. He stayed up after everyone had gone or retired, with his notes and a pot of tea, and he thought about the tribunal, and Fudge, and the Death Eaters in the southeast, and the prophecy, and a 15-year-old who had asked to begin his preparation now rather than September. He thought about all the things that could still go wrong. Then he put his notes in order, because that was all you could do, put things in order, know your plan, and be ready to move when it counted. Harry came down at midnight. Kingsley heard the footsteps on the stairs and looked up from his notes, but didn't comment. Harry went to the kitchen, came back with a glass of water, and stood in the doorway of the study looking at Kingsley the way he sometimes looked at things, like he was calibrating whether it was appropriate to say something. "Say it," Kingsley said, without looking up. "The prophecy," Harry said. "Neither can live while the other survives. That means it doesn't end until one of us is dead." "Yes," Kingsley said. "So this, the tribunal, the Order, all of it, it's all just keeping things together until that happens." Kingsley put his quill down and looked at him properly. "No," he said. "The tribunal is about Vernon Dursley being held accountable, which matters for its own sake. The Order is about protecting people, a lot of people, not just you, from a war that's already started. And you," he held Harry's gaze. "You are not just a solution to a prophecy. You are a person, and what's happening to you right now matters for its own sake, independent of anything that has to happen later." Harry leaned against the doorframe. He was looking at Kingsley with the careful attention of someone measuring the truthfulness of what they're hearing against a long internal history of being told things that turned out to be expedient rather than true. "You really believe that?" Harry said. "I do," Kingsley said. "Most people don't." "I know," Kingsley said. "Most people see the prophecy first and you second. That's not how I work." Harry was quiet for a moment. Then something in his posture shifted slightly, the same fractional drop of tension that Kingsley had observed on Privet Drive. It kept happening, small surrenders of held-breath tension, each one incremental, as though something in Harry was cautiously, methodically deciding it was safe to let go of things it had been gripping for a very long time. "Okay," Harry said. "Go to sleep," Kingsley said. "We start your preparation tomorrow. First light." Harry's eyebrows went up. "You're starting now?" "Dumbledore said beginning now," Kingsley said. "I'm taking him at his word." He picked up his quill. "I'm your Auror training structure until September. We'll do charms review in the morning, defense theory after lunch, and Sirius tells me he wants to run physical conditioning," Harry repeated. "Running, mostly. And some hand-to-hand basics. Sirius is apparently more enthusiastic about this than the curriculum technically calls for." Harry stared at him. "You and Sirius made a curriculum." "This evening, yes. While everyone was, while Molly was here and Mundungus was being, multitasking," Kingsley said simply. "Bed, Harry." Harry went to bed, and the last thing Kingsley heard before the house went quiet was what might have been laughter, quickly muffled, from the staircase. He went back to his notes and kept working, and through the window the July night sat over the Wiltshire fields, dark and still and full of things that were not yet in motion, and the safe house held against it without effort, the way things hold when they have been built properly. Chapter 4, The Tribunal. The preparation took 11 days. Not 11 days of sitting at tables with books, though there was some of that. Kingsley had requisitioned 3 crates of DMLE training material from the Ministry archives, dry procedural texts that Harry tore through with the methodical hunger of someone who had been given the map to a territory he'd been walking blind. There were theory sessions after lunch in the study, there were charms drills in the garden at 8 in the morning, and there was Sirius, who arrived every day at 6:30 with the specific energy of a man who had found something useful to do with his body and his expertise and was not going to waste a single minute of it. The running happened on the lane behind the farmhouse, a half-mile of uneven ground that Sirius ran alongside Harry with the cheerful ruthlessness of someone who had been an exceptionally fit 18-year-old once and believed the capacity was transferable. By day 4, Harry was keeping pace. By day 7, he was pulling ahead on the uphill stretch and pretending not to notice that Sirius had started breathing hard. By day 9, he was running it twice, and Sirius was doing it once and calling it a tactical decision. The defense work was Lupin's, and it was different from anything Harry had done in a classroom. Lupin had a way of teaching that treated the subject as a living thing, not a set of spells to be memorized but a framework for thinking, for reading a situation faster than the situation could read you. He drilled Harry on spell identification, on countercurse theory, on the specific magical signatures of dark spells and what they meant for your response window. He made Harry cast the same shield charm 47 times in a row one afternoon, adjusting the angle each time, until Harry could throw up a protego in approximately the time it took most people to register that something was coming. "You're already good," Lupin told him, after the 47th. "Now you're becoming reliable." "What's the difference?" Harry asked. "Good is something you are in a controlled setting," Lupin said. "Reliable is something you are when everything is on fire." Kingsley watched these sessions from the garden when he wasn't handling the increasingly demanding paper landscape of the tribunal preparation, and what he observed was not that Harry was becoming something he wasn't, but that he was becoming more of what he already was. The instinct was there, had always been there, the training was just giving it architecture. Giving it somewhere to live. Hermione arrived on day 5, with Ron in tow and the specific expression of someone who has been told that her best friend is in a secure DMLE facility and has been physically prevented from going there immediately by precisely 2 days of parental negotiation. She walked into the kitchen, took one look at Harry, and said, "You look better." Then she turned to Kingsley and said, "I've been reading about the Magical Minors Protection Act and I have some questions about the evidentiary standards." Ron looked at Harry and said, "Mate." Harry looked at Ron and said, "Yeah." That appeared to be sufficient. They disappeared into the garden and didn't come back for an hour. Hermione sat at the kitchen table with Kingsley for 45 minutes and asked questions that were sharp and organized and occasionally better than the ones Calder had asked, and Kingsley answered them all and then said, "Have you considered law?" "I've considered everything," Hermione said seriously. The tribunal was set for a Thursday. Not in the main Wisengamot chamber, this was a closed DMLE tribunal, a smaller and more procedurally specific process designed for cases involving magical minors, and it was held in Courtroom 7, which was on Level 9, below most of the Ministry's working floors. Kingsley had requested Courtroom 7 specifically. It was the smallest of the tribunal rooms, which meant the audience was limited, which meant Fudge could not pack the gallery with friendly faces. He had, predictably, tried to move it to Courtroom 10. Kingsley had filed a counter-motion under Paragraph 9 of the Tribunal Conduct Guidelines, which specified that cases involving minor victims were entitled to the least public setting available. The counter-motion was upheld by the Chief Warlock's office in 24 hours. Fudge would have received that ruling on Wednesday morning. He would have been in an office somewhere doing the recalibration of a man whose first move had been blocked and who was looking for the second. Kingsley knew he had a second move. He just didn't know yet what it was. They arrived at the Ministry at 8:15. Not through the flue. Kingsley had arranged a physical entry through a side entrance on the north side of the building, away from the main atrium, because the atrium was where the press waited and he had no intention of Harry being photographed going into a legal proceeding. Harry wore plain dark robes that Kingsley had sent from Madame Malkin's, properly fitted, properly his, no spellotape anywhere, and he walked into the Ministry of Magic with his hands loose at his sides and his new glasses clear on his face and looked, Kingsley thought, like someone who had decided to arrive. Sirius couldn't enter the Ministry. They discussed this, and Sirius had handled the discussion with more equanimity than Kingsley had expected, not peace, exactly, but the controlled resignation of someone who has learned to live inside the unfairness of his situation and still function. "Tell me everything when you come out," was all he said, and he'd gripped Harry's shoulder briefly in the hallway before they left, and Harry had covered his godfather's hand with his for a second, and then they'd gone. Lupin was in the building, technically, as an order liaison. Dumbledore had arranged a day pass, which was the kind of bureaucratic creativity Dumbledore excelled at. He was stationed in a waiting area on Level 8 and would come down if called. Calder was already in Courtroom 7 when they arrived, her documentation kit on the table, the transcription of Harry's statement in a neat folder, and 3 additional folders containing the physical evidence from Privet Drive. She was talking to a thin, precise woman with silver hair who Kingsley recognized as Solicitor Marchetti, the magical solicitor he'd had notarize Fig's deposition, and who he'd now retained as the presenting advocate for the case. Marchetti had a reputation. She had spent 30 years working primarily in the Magical Minors Protection Division and had a record that would have been considered extraordinary by any measure, and she had agreed to take this case on a Thursday afternoon phone call with Kingsley with approximately 30 seconds of deliberation. She shook Harry's hand when he came in and looked at him with the direct, assessing warmth of someone taking a measure. "Harry. I've read your statement. I may ask you some questions during the proceedings. Answer exactly what I ask, nothing more unless it feels important to add. Understood?" "Yes," Harry said. "Good." She handed him a copy of his own statement. "Read through this again this morning. Not to memorize it, you lived it, you don't need to memorize it, but to remind yourself that what's in there is the truth and you have nothing to be nervous about." "I'm not nervous," Harry said. Marchetti looked at him for a moment. "No," she said, in a tone of mild surprise. "You're not, are you?" She went back to her folders. The tribunal panel was 3 people, Chief Adjudicator Ogden, a compact, sharp-faced woman in her 60s who had the look of someone who had heard every conceivable type of argument and had opinions about all of them, Deputy Adjudicator Braithwaite, a tall man who appeared to be approximately the same age as the institution he served, and Adjudicator Hopkirk, who handled improper use matters and had been added to the panel presumably because the case touched on magical welfare protocols. Vernon Dursley was brought in by 2 DMLE officers and seated at a table across the room from Harry and Marchetti. He was in Muggle clothes, the restraints had been removed for the proceedings, a standard courtesy that Kingsley noted Vernon straightened slightly at, as though their absence restored some of his sense of himself. He had a solicitor beside him, a ministry-appointed advocate named Whitmore who looked competent enough and deeply unhappy about the evidence he'd been handed. Fudge came in at 8:55 and sat in the observer gallery with Percy Weasley beside him and two other ministry officials who Kingsley identified as members of the Ministerial Communications Office. He had a notepad. He was writing on it before the session even started. Kingsley sat at the secondary advocate table, which technically made him a supporting officer rather than a party to the case, and he watched the room arrange itself around its various agendas the way a chessboard arranges itself before the opening move. Harry was looking at Vernon. Vernon was looking at the table in front of him. Marchetti opened the case in 11 minutes, which was approximately half the time most advocates took, because she did not use unnecessary language. She stated the charges. She laid out the evidentiary structure, what would be presented, in what order, and what it demonstrated. She said, without drama and without pause, the evidence in this case is extensive, consistent, and corroborated by multiple independent sources. The panel will find at the conclusion of this hearing that the charges are substantiated in full. Whitmore made his opening in 7 minutes and spent most of it establishing that Vernon Dursley was a law-abiding Muggle citizen who had, under significant personal difficulty, provided a home for a child he had not sought or prepared for. Ogden said, "Thank you," in a tone that committed to nothing. The evidence went in over the first 90 minutes. Calder presented the physical documentation, the dimensions of the cupboard, the photographic record, the 3 exterior locks on the front door and the food flap on the bedroom door. She presented it in the flat, methodical voice of a professional who has done this before and understands that the evidence speaks most powerfully when you let it speak without embellishment. She answered Whitmore's cross-examination without changing her tone by a single degree, and when he suggested that the locks on the bedroom door could have had any number of explanations, she produced a signed statement from the specialist who had installed them, dated 2 years ago, which listed the stated reason for installation as containment of an unruly adolescent. Whitmore sat down. Arabella Figg gave her testimony by written deposition, read into the record by Marchetti in the crisp, specific voice of someone reading a document that doesn't need ornamentation. 8 pages. 9 years. Specific incidents, specific dates, specific observations. The panel listened with the concentrated attention of people who are building a picture and watching it become definitive. Ogden asked 2 questions, both of them precise. Braithwaite asked 1. Hop Kirk wrote something in her notes. Fudge was still writing on his notepad. At 10:30, Marchetti said, "I'd like to call Harry Potter." Harry walked to the witness chair with his hands loose and his back straight and his face open in a way that was different from blankness. He wasn't closed or performing calm, he was genuinely present, genuinely there, looking at the panel with the direct, unhurried attention he brought to everything when he was focused. Marchetti took him through the abuse chronology methodically and not unkindly. She confirmed details, she established timelines, she made sure the record was clear on the specifics that the physical evidence had raised. Harry answered each question as he'd answered Calder's, with precision, without embellishment, correcting himself when a detail was imprecise rather than letting an imprecision stand. It was when Marchetti shifted to the graveyard that the room changed. She didn't make it theatrical. She established, in 3 questions, that Harry's presence in the Triwizard Tournament had been involuntary, that he had not entered his own name, and that the consequences of this involuntary participation had included direct contact with Voldemort. Then she said, "Harry, can you describe what happened in that graveyard to the best of your recollection?" And Harry described it. The tribunal room had the attentive silence of people hearing something that demands stillness. He went through it the same way he'd gone through it for Calder, precisely, chronologically, without flinching from the difficult parts. The killing curse. Cedric. The Death Eaters. The names of those present. The restoration ritual, described in specific and clinical detail because he had paid close attention to what was happening and his mind had recorded it the way minds record things that are simultaneously terrible and critically important. Ogden was watching him with an expression that had moved from professional assessment to something more human and had stayed there. Braithwaite had stopped writing. Lucius Malfoy, Harry said, steady, direct, looking at the panel, was in that graveyard. I saw his face when Voldemort removed his hood. I know what Lucius Malfoy looks like. He attended the Quidditch World Cup earlier that year. I saw him there. He was present. He is a Death Eater and he was there. He named them all. 8 names, with the specificity of a witness who had memorized them because he'd understood even in the graveyard that getting out alive and being able to report what he'd seen were not separable objectives. Marchetti said, "Thank you, Harry." She looked at the panel. I raised the graveyard testimony not to adjudicate matters that fall outside this tribunal's jurisdiction, but to establish the direct connection between Harry Potter's current protective requirements and the danger he faces, danger that is immediate, specific, and connected to the person responsible for his parents' deaths. The protection available at number 4, Privet Drive, as administered by the Dursley family, is not adequate protection for a child in this situation. It never was, and it certainly isn't now. Whitmore stood for cross-examination of Harry and looked, Kingsley thought, like a man who had assessed the situation and made a professional decision not to make it worse. He asked Harry 2 questions about the timeline of his first year at Hogwarts, both of which Harry answered accurately and without complication, and then Whitmore sat down. Fudge stood up. Technically, Fudge was an observer. He had no standing to speak in a closed DMLE tribunal. Every person in the room knew this. Fudge stood up anyway. "Minister," Ogden said, with the specific cool of someone who is about to say something clearly and without repetition. "You have observer status in these proceedings. I am exercising my right as Minister for Magic to address matters of national security that arise within. There is no such right in a closed tribunal," Ogden said. "Sit down, Minister." The room was very quiet. Fudge sat down. His face was the color of old brick. Percy Weasley wrote something on his own notepad with the furious purpose of someone trying to look like they're doing something useful. Marchetti's closing took 12 minutes and it was architecturally perfect. She built from the physical evidence to the witness testimony to the legal precedent to the conclusion, and each step was load-bearing, nothing decorative, nothing excessive. Whitmore's closing was competent and sad in the way that well-argued losing positions always are. The panel retired at 12:15. Kingsley stood and stretched and looked at Harry, who was sitting in his chair with his arms folded and his legs stretched out in front of him, not tense, not deflated, just waiting in the easy way of someone who has done what they could do and is comfortable with what they've done. "You did well," Kingsley said. "I just told the truth," Harry said. "That's what doing well looks like in a tribunal," Kingsley said. Across the room, Vernon was speaking in a low voice to Whitmore, and whatever Whitmore was saying was clearly not what Vernon wanted to hear, because Vernon's expression was doing things that suggested he had arrived at the tribunal expecting the customary world to reassert itself on his behalf and had discovered that it was declining to do so. He hadn't looked at Harry directly once during the entire proceeding, which was a specific kind of cowardice that Kingsley had observed before, the refusal to see, clearly, the person you had been telling yourself didn't matter. Fudge came across the room. Kingsley stood between him and Harry without making a production of it, just a shift of weight, a change in position, the way you close a door. He looked at Fudge and waited. "I want to speak to the boy," Fudge said. "Harry isn't available for conversation right now," Kingsley said pleasantly. "Shacklebolt, this is beyond. If you have something to say that's relevant to these proceedings, you can submit it in writing to Adjudicator Ogden," Kingsley said. "If you have something to say to me, we can arrange a meeting through official channels, as I believe I mentioned last week." He held Fudge's gaze. "Is there anything else?" Fudge's mustache was doing something expressive. He was aware of the room, Calder taking notes, Marchetti watching from her table, the 2 ministry communications officials in the gallery who would carry the picture of this moment back with them. He was calculating. "You've made an enemy today," he said. He said it quietly, which he apparently thought made it more weighty. "I've had enemies," Kingsley said, in the same pleasant tone he'd been using since Fudge walked over. "I'll manage." Fudge left. Harry, who had heard all of it, looked at Kingsley with an expression that was trying not to be amused and mostly failing. "That was very calm," he said. "Thank you," Kingsley said. "Do you practice that or is it natural?" "Both," Kingsley said. Harry made a sound that was definitely a laugh, and Marchetti looked over from her table with an expression that suggested she had been in a great many tribunals and this was not how they usually sounded while the panel was deliberating, and she looked like she didn't entirely mind. The panel came back at 1:47. Ogden read the verdict with the precision of someone who has weighed a thing carefully and arrived at a clear conclusion and has no patience for anything that is not clarity. Substantiated on all primary charges. Substantiated on the 2 secondary charges, willful psychological mistreatment and deliberate suppression of the subject's cultural and magical heritage. Sentencing to be determined at a separate hearing in 3 weeks, pending a full assessment by a ministry welfare specialist. Vernon Dursley sat very still. Petunia Dursley, who was not present but would receive a formal notification before end of day, would be required to attend a separate statement hearing, the timing of which would be communicated by the DMLE. A formal note of Harry's graveyard testimony had been entered into the DMLE record as a flagged supplementary matter, designated for review by the senior Auror team. That last part was Ogden's addition. Unprompted, unrequested, the action of a woman who had been listening very carefully and had drawn her own professional conclusions. Fudge, from the observer gallery, looked like someone who had just discovered that a door he thought he'd locked had been left open by someone with a better key. Calder wrote everything down. They came out of the ministry through the same north entrance they'd gone in, and the afternoon hit them with the specific quality of July light after a morning spent underground, warm, slightly disorienting, the particular aliveness of the outside world after institutional air. Harry stopped on the pavement for a moment and turned his face toward it, eyes closed, just briefly, the way people do when they need a second to confirm that the world is still there. Lupin was waiting. He fell into step beside Harry as they walked and didn't ask for a full account immediately, just said, "How are you?" in the direct, genuine way that he had. "All right," Harry said. "We won." "I know," Lupin said. "Marchetti sent a Patronus." He glanced at Harry. "The graveyard testimony is in the DMLE record," Harry said. Ogden added it. Unprompted. Lupin was quiet for a moment. "Ogden's a good adjudicator." "She is," Kingsley said, from behind them. "She's also on the Wisengamot Oversight Board, which means the flagged supplementary matter has a direct path to the board without going through Fudge's office." Lupin turned to look at Kingsley. He had the expression of a man watching something several moves ahead of where he'd been looking. "You expected her to do that?" "I hoped she would," Kingsley said. "I arranged for her to be on the panel. I didn't ask her to do anything, I just made sure she heard the testimony directly." "That's," Lupin started. "Tidy," Harry said. Kingsley almost smiled. "I prefer thorough." They walked for a moment in the kind of easy silence that comes after something difficult that has gone right. Around them, London was being Thursday afternoon London, indifferent, busy, full of people who had no idea that a 15-year-old had just told a legal tribunal in exact and specific detail about the night Voldemort came back, and a panel of adjudicators had listened and written it down and put it somewhere it couldn't be quietly buried. "What does Fudge do now?" Harry asked. "He panics," Kingsley said. "And when he panics, he overreaches. And when he overreaches," he looked at Harry. "We'll be ready for it." Harry nodded. He was looking at the street ahead with the forward-facing attention of someone who has dealt with the last thing and is already looking toward the next. It was the quality Kingsley had come to associate specifically with him, not recklessness, not aggression, just the orientation of a person who has decided to face the direction that things are coming from. Can I ask you something? Harry said. Go ahead. The night you came to Privet Drive, Harry said. What made you decide? Not the warrant, I know the warrant. I mean, what made you decide that this was the thing, the right moment? Kingsley walked for a moment before answering. They passed a bus stop, a newsagent, an ordinary piece of the city's ordinary infrastructure. There wasn't a single moment, he said. It built. For years of watching the system fail you while people with good intentions told each other it was necessary. He looked ahead. But if you're asking what made me stop waiting, he paused. You came back from that graveyard carrying Cedric Diggory. You came back with your dead classmate because he asked you to and you did it, and then you had to sit in a hospital wing while people debated whether to believe you. And then we sent you back to Privet Drive. He let that land. That was the moment where I stopped being able to call it complicated and started calling it wrong. Harry walked beside him and didn't say anything for a while. The city moved around them, unhurried and vast and magnificently unconcerned. Thank you, he said finally. Not performatively. Just directly, the way he said most things. Don't thank me, Kingsley said. It's the job. No, it isn't, Harry said simply. It's more than the job and you know it. He wasn't asking for confirmation. He was just stating what he'd observed, accurately, with the precision he applied to everything, and Kingsley had enough honesty in him to not argue with it. Then, he said, you're welcome. Sirius was at the safe house when they arrived, pacing the kitchen in the way he did when he'd been waiting somewhere with nothing useful to do, and the moment Harry walked through the door he stopped pacing and looked at him and read the answer off Harry's face before anyone said a word. We won, Sirius said. We won, Harry said. And Sirius grabbed him again, less desperate this time, more celebratory, the kind of contact that has joy in it rather than relief, and Harry laughed against his shoulder, and it was a different kind of laugh than the surprised, cautious ones from before. This one had room in it. This one wasn't worried about its own welcome. Kingsley went to put the kettle on. Lupin was in the doorway behind him and Kingsley heard him say, quietly, he's going to be all right, and Kingsley said, yes. He is, and it meant something different than it had a week ago. It wasn't reassurance now, it was observation. He made the tea. Outside the window the afternoon was settling into early evening, the light turning from white to gold, and the fields were doing what Wiltshire fields did in July, which was be quietly, extravagantly green. His Patronus arrived from Calder at 5:30, a silvery otter that materialized above the kitchen table and said, in Calder's clear professional voice, full documentation filed. Ogden's notation has been formally recorded. Something to tell you when you're clear. Fudge called an emergency meeting of the Ministerial Communications Board. Don't know the agenda yet. Watch the Prophet tomorrow morning. Kingsley looked at the otter until it faded. What? Harry asked, from the doorway. Tomorrow may be interesting, Kingsley said. More interesting than today? Differently, Kingsley said. He handed Harry a mug of tea. Drink that. We're doing Charms review at 7 tomorrow morning. Harry took the mug. He looked at Kingsley with the look that meant he'd clocked everything Kingsley had said and hadn't said and was filing it appropriately. You're not going to tell me what the Patronus said. I'm going to tell you in the morning when I have more information, Kingsley said. Tonight you should eat something and talk to Sirius and not think about Fudge. Can I not think about Fudge and still be thinking about what comes next? Those two things can coexist, Kingsley said. Harry leaned against the doorframe with his mug and looked at the kitchen, the ordinary, warm, wooden table reality of a room that was not Privet Drive and was not the Ministry and was not a graveyard, just a kitchen with tea in it and people who had just won something real together. The sentencing hearing is in 3 weeks, he said. Yes. And Fudge is going to do something before then. Almost certainly. So we need to be ready. We are ready, Kingsley said. We've been ready. The difference now is that he knows it. Harry thought about that for a moment, turning his mug between his hands. Then he nodded, once, and something settled in him, not complacency, the opposite of complacency, the composed readiness of someone who has assessed the terrain and decided they can hold it. "Good," he said. Sirius called from the sitting room that he was extremely hungry and someone should do something about that, and the moment broke cleanly, and Harry went to argue with his godfather about whose turn it was to figure out dinner, and the safe house was full of noise for a while, ordinary and warm and real. Kingsley stayed in the kitchen and watched the evening come in through the window, and thought about Fudge's emergency meeting, and Ogden's notation, and the way the pieces were arranged now versus how they'd been arranged 11 days ago when he'd knocked on a door in Surrey at 5:52 in the morning. The board had changed. It kept changing. That was the nature of it. He finished his tea and went to help with dinner, and the night came down over Wiltshire quietly, and the war held its breath one more time, and for now, for this evening, it was enough. Chapter 5, The Strike. The Prophet ran it on Friday morning under a headline that took up half the front page. Potter's accusations, a pattern of manipulation? Ministry sources raise concerns over DMLE case filed against Muggle family. Kingsley read it at the kitchen table before anyone else was up, with his tea going cold beside him and the particular quality of stillness that meant he was reading something carefully and not reacting to it until he'd finished. The article was a Skeeter piece. She wasn't credited directly, the byline said staff reporter, but the fingerprints were everywhere, in the specific cadence of the sentences and the way each fact was technically accurate and contextually dishonest. It quoted ministry sources who raised concerns about the timing of the DMLE action. It used the word allegations 11 times. It referred to Harry as the troubled teenager whose extraordinary claims following the Triwizard Tournament have already raised questions among senior ministry officials. It quoted Fudge, who expressed his deep personal concern about the well-being of the Dursley family, who have given so much to support a difficult child. It did not mention Arabella Figg. It did not mention the 3 external locks on the front door. It did not mention the cupboard under the stairs. At the bottom, in a smaller font that suggested it had been added late, the DMLE declined to comment. Kingsley had declined to comment because he hadn't been asked. He filed that away. Harry came down at 6:15 and saw the paper on the table and read it standing up, one hand resting on the back of a chair. His expression went through something during the reading, not surprise, not distress, something cooler and more considered, the look of a person seeing a move they half expected executed in roughly the way they'd anticipated. "Troubled teenager," he said. "Yes." They didn't quote anyone real. "Ministry sources," Kingsley said. "Which means someone in Fudge's office spoke to Skeeter off the record. Not illegal, but traceable if you know how to look." "Are you going to look?" "Calder already is," Kingsley said. "She sent me a Patronus at 5:30 this morning. She doesn't sleep much." Harry set the paper down. He didn't throw it, didn't crumple it, just set it back on the table with the deliberate calm of someone who has decided a thing doesn't get to affect them more than it warrants. "What do we do?" "Nothing reactive," Kingsley said. "We don't respond to Skeeter, we don't issue statements, we don't change anything we're doing. The record we've built is real. The article isn't." He looked at Harry. "What Fudge wants is for us to respond emotionally. To look defensive. To start making moves that look like we're worried. And we're not," Harry said. "We're not," Kingsley confirmed. Harry sat down. Poured himself tea. "Hermione's going to see this." "She probably saw it before you did," Kingsley said. Harry almost smiled. "Yeah. She'll want to write a letter to the Prophet." "She can write it," Kingsley said. "I'd advise not sending it. Good luck telling her that." Hermione arrived at 9 with a letter she'd already written and very firm feelings about it. Kingsley read the letter, which was excellent, rigorously argued, factually precise, and exactly the kind of thing that would have made the situation worse if published, and explained why it couldn't be sent, and watched Hermione work through the frustration of understanding a sound strategic argument while finding it personally unsatisfying. So we just let them say what they want, she said. We let them say what they want while we build something that makes what they say irrelevant, Kingsley said. Those are different things. Hermione looked at him. She was doing the thing she did when she was deciding whether an argument was actually right or just persuasive, checking it from multiple angles with the particular intensity of someone who had been burned by accepting persuasive but wrong reasoning before. All right, she said at last, with the tone of someone reserving the right to revisit. All right. Ron had read the article too and had less to say about strategy and more to say about fudge, which was less useful analytically but had its own value, and Harry listened to Ron be specifically and creatively furious on his behalf with the expression of someone who finds this both unnecessary and genuinely touching. The attack came at 11:17 that night. Kingsley was in the study. Harry, Ron, and Hermione had gone to bed an hour earlier, Sirius was staying the night, asleep in the upstairs room, and Lupin had gone back to wherever Dumbledore currently had him stationed. Kingsley was at his desk with the sentencing hearing preparation, a cup of tea, and the quiet discipline of a man who does his best work when everyone else has stopped. The wards screamed. Not literally, they were a magical alarm, a specific vibration that resonated through the bones of the building, a sensation like a deep bell struck close, but Kingsley was on his feet before the sound had finished, wand in hand, the training of 20 years compressing every response into the first second rather than the third. He went to the window without turning on a light. The lane behind the farmhouse was dark but for the moon, and in the moonlight he counted 4 of them, moving up from the southern end of the lane with the particular purposeful silence of people who had practiced approaching warded buildings, who had disabled or worked around the outer perimeter charm and were now dealing with the inner layer, which was going to hold for approximately 90 seconds longer than they expected because Calder had added a secondary lattice during her walkthrough. And they didn't know about it. They were wearing masks. Dark robes. Moving in a formation that suggested training. Kingsley was already in the hallway. Sirius. He put his hand on the bedroom door and pushed it open without knocking. Up. Now. South approach, for confirmed, possibly more. Sirius was out of bed with his wand before Kingsley finished the sentence. Not the befuddled wakefulness of a man pulled from sleep, the immediate, operational alertness of someone who had spent years as a fugitive and had never entirely stopped sleeping like one. Number 4 visible. Assume 6. Formation. Standard sweep. They've dealt with the outer ward. Who told them about the outer ward, Sirius said, and it wasn't a question, it was the compression of a complicated and furious realization into 5 words. He shoved his feet into his boots. Kingsley went to Harry's room. Harry was already awake. Already dressed. He was standing by the door of his room with his wand in his hand and the expression of someone who had heard the wards and knew exactly what they meant, and Kingsley pushed the door open and found him not hiding behind the furniture or frozen by the window but standing like someone who had been waiting for the start signal. Death Eaters? Harry said. Almost certainly, Kingsley said. Stay close to me. Do not go outside alone for any reason. If we get separated, we won't, Harry said. If we get separated, Kingsley repeated, meeting his eyes, you find a room with no windows and you hold it. You do not come looking for anyone. Clear? Harry looked at him. Clear. Hermione and Ron? I'll get them, Harry said, and was already in the hallway. Kingsley went back downstairs in the dark, not because he couldn't see in the light but because light told people where you were, and knowing where you were was the first thing an organized assault team tried to establish. The inner ward held for another 40 seconds. When it broke cleanly, a professional dispellation, not brute-forced, which meant at least one of the people outside had ward-breaking skills, which narrowed the field considerably. Kingsley noted this with the part of his brain that was always noting things and kept moving. He was standing in the kitchen doorway when the first one came through the south window. The reducto hit the window frame a half-second before the person came through after it, which was the sequence of a practiced entry: break the barrier, exploit the gap, don't give the defender time to reset. Textbook. It would have worked against someone with a half-second slower reaction time. Kingsley had been anticipating the entry point because he'd noted the south window as the most likely approach vector when he'd first assessed the building, and his shield charm was already up when the reducto came through, and when the Death Eater came through after it he was already moving, not away, toward, closing the distance before the attacker had fully oriented in the dark interior. And the full body bind he cast at a range of 4 feet was not flashy or complicated, and it didn't need to be. The first Death Eater hit the kitchen floor. The second one came through the front door. The front door was, technically, warded with a lock charm that required either the correct magical signature or sufficient force to overcome. Sufficient force, in this case, turned out to be a blasting curse that took out the door, the frame, and approximately 2 feet of wall on either side, which was both destructive and loud, and which was exactly the kind of move that announced we are not trying to be subtle anymore. Sirius was in the hallway. Kingsley heard the exchange from the kitchen, the rapid crack of spell fire, 2 voices, Sirius's voice not shouting but sharp and controlled, the quality of someone who is fighting at close range and has decided to end it quickly. A curse ricocheted off the hallway wall and blew a hole in the plaster. Then a body landed on the hallway floor, and Sirius said, with the flat satisfaction of a man who has resolved a problem, 2. 2 here, Kingsley said, and bound the second kitchen attacker, who had come through the broken window while Kingsley was dealing with the door. 4 confirmed. 2 down, 2 bound. That left the ones they hadn't counted yet. Harry came down the stairs at a pace that was not running but was the fastest possible walk, and he came around the corner into the hallway with his wand up and his eyes moving across the space with the trained assessment that Lupin had been drilling into him for 11 days, reading the room the way you read a room when it might be trying to kill you. He almost walked into Sirius, who grabbed his arm and said quietly, "South and east clear. Check west." No preamble, no fuss. Operational shorthand, treating Harry like someone who could work with the information, and Harry processed it immediately. 2 more, Harry said. At least. How do you know? The wards went in 3 points when they broke, Harry said. I felt it. South, east, and somewhere northwest. The northwest approach hasn't engaged yet. Sirius looked at him for half a second with an expression that was not surprise exactly but something adjacent, the look of a man recalibrating his picture of what someone is capable of. Ward sensitivity, he said, almost to himself. Right. Go. They moved together through the dark house, Sirius taking the kitchen side and Harry moving toward the sitting room, and the spell hit the sitting room window a fraction before Harry cleared the doorway, which was the only reason he wasn't standing directly in front of it when it came through. He wasn't standing in front of it. He was standing to the left of it, against the wall, and when the Death Eater came through the window, Harry was not where any tactical calculation said he should be. The Death Eater had half a second of confused reorientation. Harry used it. Expelliarmus at point-blank range, which at point-blank range was not a gentle disarming but a concussive force, knocking the Death Eater off their feet and into the far wall, wand spinning away in the dark. Harry caught the wand with his left hand without looking at it because he'd practiced that catch with Lupin until it was instinct, and he pointed his own wand at the downed figure and said, "Stay down," with a clarity that was not aggressive and therefore was considerably more alarming than aggressive would have been. The Death Eater stayed down. Sirius appeared in the doorway behind him. He looked at the downed Death Eater, at Harry, at the caught wand in Harry's left hand. 3, he said. 3, Harry confirmed. 1 more, Sirius said. Kingsley said northwest approach. Outside still, Harry said. Or they'd have come in by now. Cover the room, Sirius said, and went back into the hallway. Harry held the sitting room. The bound Death Eater didn't move. The downed one watched Harry from the floor with the masked face that told nothing about the expression underneath it and that Harry had decided said plenty about the person wearing it. The choice to hide your face when you came to do what these people came to do was a specific kind of cowardice that Harry had catalogued alongside other things that had stopped frightening him. Ron appeared at the top of the stairs with his wand out, hair vertical with sleep, looking extremely alert despite this. "What do I do?" "Come down and stand in the hallway," Harry said. "Don't go outside." Ron came down the stairs with the forward-leaning urgency of someone who desperately wanted to be useful. "Where's Hermione?" "Behind you," said Hermione, from the top of the stairs, who was fully dressed and had apparently taken the time to find her own wand and her shoes and put them both on, because she was Hermione. She came down after Ron and stopped at the bottom. "Is everyone 3 down?" Harry said. "One more." "Outside?" "Northwest approach," Harry said. "Kingsley and Sirius have it." They had it. The 6th Death Eater, there were, in the end, 6, had approached from the northwest along the outer wall of the property and had stopped when the inner ward broke, which told Kingsley that this one was either the most cautious of the group or the most senior, holding back to assess before committing. The caution didn't help when Kingsley came through the side door of the farmhouse and immediately put a binding curse on the section of wall the figure was pressed against, not to hit them, he knew where they were, the ward residue told him, but to close off the exit route. The Death Eater bolted for the field. Kingsley let them get 20 feet into the field, which was enough distance to establish that they weren't going to stop and enough distance that any spell fire exchanged would not risk the building, and then he cast the impediment jinx with the complete, unhurried accuracy of someone who practices this specific cast weekly and has for 15 years. The figure went down in the dark grass. Kingsley walked toward them, cast the binding, and pulled off the mask. He didn't recognize the face immediately, which told him this was a newer recruit, not one of the core inner circle. Young, actually, 20, perhaps 25. The face of someone who had made a decision that they now appeared to be reconsidering in a field in Wiltshire at midnight with both wrists bound and a senior Auror standing over them. "Name," Kingsley said. The young man said nothing. "You'll give it at the ministry," Kingsley said. "That's fine." He cast a tracking charm on the binding and turned back toward the house. "Proud of yourself?" Still nothing. But the silence had a different quality to it now, not defiance, more like someone who has run very fast towards something and arrived and found it was not what they'd been told it would be. He came back inside to find Harry in the kitchen making tea, which was so specifically and perfectly Harry that Kingsley stopped in the doorway for a moment and just looked at the scene. Sirius was leaning against the counter with his arms folded, watching Harry with the expression he'd been wearing since the moment in the sitting room. Ron was at the table looking slightly wild-eyed but functional. Hermione was sitting beside Ron with her wand still in her hand, pointed at nothing, still in threat assessment mode. The 5 bound Death Eaters were lined up along the hallway wall. One of them was still wearing their mask. The other 4 had been unmasked by Sirius, who had been extremely thorough about it, and whose expression when he'd done it had been the kind of expression that meant he'd recognized some of the faces and was filing them. "Anyone hurt?" Kingsley said. "No," Harry said, without turning from the kettle. "Harry caught a wand mid-combat," Sirius said, with the tone of someone who cannot not mention this. "Left-handed." Mid-sentence. "I practiced it," Harry said. "I know you practiced it. I watched you practice it." "I didn't think you'd," Sirius stopped. Made a gesture. "Never mind." 6 attackers, Kingsley said. 5 bound in the hallway, 1 in the field. No injuries to anyone in this building. The structure is damaged. He looked at the kitchen wall, which had taken some secondary blast damage from the front door destruction. Reparable. Hermione had her wand pointed at a Death Eater now. Not threateningly, just ready. "Who sent them?" she said. "We'll find out," Kingsley said. "But you think Voldemort," Ron said. "The timing suggests the tribunal," Kingsley said. He sat down at the table. Ogden's notation put Harry's graveyard testimony into formal DMLE record. Someone wanted that stopped before it could build any momentum. This was meant to be either an assassination or a seizure, and either way the timing makes the purpose clear. He looked at Harry. "Which means it's also evidence." Harry turned from the kettle and looked at him. 6 Death Eaters attacking a DMLE safe house the day after Harry's graveyard testimony entered the official ministry record, Kingsley said, is not a coincidence that any reasonable person can look at and call a coincidence. Hermione put her wand down on the table. It proves he was telling the truth, she said, and the sentence had a specific quality to it, not relief, exactly, but the sound of someone who has always believed something watching the rest of the world catch up. An attack like this proves there was something to be afraid of. It proves Voldemort is back, Kingsley said. Or someone who believes he's back was sufficiently motivated to send 6 agents to this location tonight. The distinction matters less than the fact. Harry sat down at the table. He had 3 mugs of tea on a tray, which he distributed without ceremony. He looked calm, not blank, not performed, genuinely steady in the way that had been building over the last 2 weeks, the composure of someone who has been tested and has found the floor. "You're going to arrest all 6, he said. "Yes." "And process them tonight." "Yes." "I'll send a Patronus to Proudfoot and Williamson and the DMLE emergency response team. They'll be here within the hour. And the attack itself goes into the record." "It was already in the record when it happened," Kingsley said. "The wards log every contact. The magical signature of each spell cast tonight is time-stamped and stored. 6 simultaneous magical attacks on a protected DMLE facility is documented in about 14 different ways before I file a single word of my own report." Harry was quiet for a moment. "Fudge can't suppress that." "He can try," Kingsley said. "He'll fail." "Because it's in 14 places," Harry said. "Because it's in 14 places," Kingsley confirmed. Ron looked between them. "This is a very calm conversation for 2 people who just had a fight in their house," he said. "We won the fight," Harry said simply. The DMLE emergency team arrived in 47 minutes, which was Proudfoot's fastest response time on a safe house incident and which Kingsley suspected was connected to Proudfoot's personal feelings about the case rather than departmental efficiency alone. Proudfoot came through the door, took in the hallway full of bound Death Eaters, the blown-out front wall, and the 5 people sitting in the kitchen drinking tea, and said, "Everyone's all right?" "Fine," Kingsley said. 6 attackers, all bound. 1 in the field, tagged with a tracker. Magical evidence logs are intact." Proudfoot looked at the Death Eaters in the hallway. He walked down the line and looked at each face with the professional attention of a man building his own inventory. When he reached the 3rd one, something in his face went very still. "That's Avery," he said. "Yes," Kingsley said, from the kitchen. "Avery was cleared after the First War," Proudfoot said. "Said he acted under imperius." "Most of them did," Kingsley said. "Some of them even believed it." Proudfoot looked at Avery for a long moment. Then he looked back at Kingsley. "This is going to be a problem for about 40 different people who currently hold ministry positions." "I know," Kingsley said. "That's partly the point." Calder arrived 10 minutes after Proudfoot. She came in, assessed the room, opened her documentation kit, and began. She did not express surprise, she did not express alarm, she moved through the damaged farmhouse with the same methodical thoroughness she'd brought to Privet Drive and produced exactly the same quality of irrefutable record. At some point she appeared in the kitchen doorway and said to Harry, "Can you describe the magical sensation you felt when the wards broke in 3 points? I want to get your exact wording for the record." Harry described it. Precisely, in the vocabulary that Kingsley and Lupin had given him over 11 days of training, and Calder wrote it down, and the quill ran alongside her, and all of it was captured and dated and real. Hermione, watching this, said quietly to nobody in particular, "He felt a 3-point ward breach from inside the building and identified the northwest approach before the attacker engaged. That's a very advanced sensitivity." "He's been practicing ward theory," Kingsley said, in the same tone. "For 11 days, Hermione said. "He's a quick study," Kingsley said, and looked at Harry, who had the grace to look slightly uncomfortable with the attention, which Kingsley found genuinely endearing. Sirius took the 6 Death Eaters in 2 batches to a holding space that the emergency response team had set up in the lane, and he did it with the efficiency of someone who had decided to be professional about it and the expression of someone for whom being professional was costing something. He came back in after the 2nd batch and stood in the kitchen doorway and said, "Lucius Malfoy's not among them." "No," Kingsley said. "Bellatrix isn't either." "No. So this is, what, a mid-tier team. Capable enough to find the location, to get through the outer ward. But not the people Voldemort uses when he wants something done absolutely. He might not know yet what happened at the tribunal," Kingsley said. "If this was ordered before Ogden's notation, if the order went out Wednesday night after the emergency ministerial meeting, then this is Fudge's panic, not Voldemort's strategy," Sirius said. "Possibly," Kingsley said. "Or both." Sirius sat down. He looked at his hands for a moment, and the controlled professional energy he'd maintained through the last 90 minutes did something, not broke, but shifted, showed the shape of what was underneath it. "They knew where this house was," he said, quietly. "Yes," Kingsley said. "Someone told them." "Yes." The kitchen was very quiet. Hermione and Ron had picked up on the shift and gone still. Harry was looking at Kingsley. "Mundungus," Harry said. Kingsley said nothing. Which was its own answer. "He left on Thursday," Harry said. "He knew the address." "Several people knew the address," Kingsley said carefully. "But Mundungus is the one who sells things," Harry said, with the flat, unsentimental precision of someone assembling facts without emotional investment in what they add up to. "He has contacts everywhere and he doesn't always think carefully about which contacts those are." Sirius said a word that made Hermione raise her eyebrows. "I'm not certain," Kingsley said. "I'm going to be certain within 48 hours. Right now what I know is that the location has been compromised, which means we need to move." He looked around the table. "Tomorrow morning. I'll arrange an alternate location tonight." "The Burrow," Ron said. "Possibly," Kingsley said. "Definitely," Harry said, and there was something in the way he said it, not defiant, just certain, the tone of someone who has decided which direction they're moving. "If the location is compromised, it doesn't matter where we go, we need people we trust, and the Burrow has Molly, which is approximately the equivalent of a natural disaster in terms of defensive capability." Sirius made a noise that was entirely genuine laughter. "She'd like that," Ron said, with the specific experience of someone who has grown up knowing it was true. Kingsley thought about it. The Burrow was not ideal from a pure security standpoint. It was known to several Order members and therefore to anyone those members had inadvertently disclosed to, but it was warded, it was populated, and it had the specific protection of being a home, which operated on slightly different magical principles than a DMLE commissioned safe house. And Molly Weasley's wards, which she'd been layering and strengthening over 20 years of raising magical children, were not to be underestimated. "I'll contact Arthur tonight," he said. "Can I be there?" Sirius said. It came out less professionally than he probably intended. Just a man asking a question about a place where people he loved were going to be. Kingsley looked at him. "I'll arrange it." Sirius nodded, and the careful professionalism came back, and he picked up his tea, and the kitchen settled back into the specific texture of people who have come through something together and are sitting with what it was. The emergency response team finished processing the scene at 3 in the morning. Calder's documentation ran to 42 pages. Proudfoot took personal custody of the Death Eater identifications and sent 4 patron uses in quick succession, to Williamson, to the head of the DMLE, to the Wisengamot Oversight Board, and to Dumbledore. Dumbledore arrived through the flue at 3:15, took in the damage to the farmhouse with the look of a man absorbing information quickly and reorganizing his picture around it, and went straight to Harry. "You're uninjured," he said. "Fine," Harry said. "We all are." Dumbledore looked at him for a long moment. The quality of the look was different to any that had passed between them before, not the careful guardedness of a man managing information, not the warm distance of a mentor with complicated feelings about his student's destiny. Something more direct. Something that had less calculation in it. "You engaged during the attack," he said. "Yes," Harry said. "There were 6 of them. I'm told you disarmed one at close range and held the room." "Sirius and Kingsley had the hallway and the field," Harry said. "Someone had to hold the sitting room." Dumbledore was quiet for a moment. "Yes," he said. "Someone did." It wasn't quite approval. It wasn't quite pride. It was the sound of a man revising a model he'd been operating from for 4 years, updating it to match the actual person standing in front of him, and finding that the update was both necessary and not unwelcome. "The attack establishes that the location was compromised," Kingsley said, from across the room, "because they needed to be moving. We relocate tomorrow. I'd recommend a conversation about the Order's internal security." Dumbledore nodded. "I'll convene the relevant members tomorrow evening." He looked at Kingsley with the specific look that meant they were both thinking the same thing about the same person. "I'll handle Mundungus." "I want to know what he knew," Kingsley said. "Not just what he did. What he knew and when and who he spoke to." "You'll know," Dumbledore said. "Tonight was survivable," Kingsley said. "The next one might not be if we don't close the hole." He said it without drama, just as the factual assessment it was, and Dumbledore received it the same way. Harry sat in the garden at 4 in the morning because the sky was doing the thing it did before dawn, going from black to the particular dark blue that meant the light was gathering somewhere just below the horizon, and because he needed about 10 minutes without walls around him. Sirius found him there, inevitably, because Sirius had radar for when Harry was somewhere processing something. They sat on the stone wall, the same one Kingsley had watched Harry sit on from the kitchen window, 2 weeks and a lifetime ago, and they looked at the sky going from dark blue towards something paler, and neither of them said anything for a while. "You did well tonight," Sirius said finally. "You said that already. I'm saying it again." He was looking at the sky. "James would have done exactly what you did. He had the same instinct for it, close the distance, don't give them time to reset." He stopped. "You remind me of him sometimes." "Not all the time. You're your own thing. But sometimes." Harry let that sit. He'd been given a lot of James Potter information over the years and it had always arrived second-hand and slightly managed, passed through the filter of what the adults saying it thought Harry needed. This was different. This was Sirius just saying a true thing at 4 in the morning because it was true. "What was he like in a fight?" Harry said. Sirius thought about it. "Fast," he said. "And smart. He didn't just react, he thought while he was reacting. He was always 2 steps ahead and he made it look like one." He paused. "He got better as the war got worse." That sounds like a terrible thing to say, but it's true. Some people fall apart when the stakes get high enough. He got clearer. Harry absorbed this. "I need to be better," he said. "Not self-criticism. Just assessment." "You are better," Sirius said. "Than you were 3 weeks ago. Than you were last year, before the graveyard. You're becoming," he stopped. "You're becoming very difficult to kill, Harry, which is the single most important thing I need you to be." Harry looked at him. "Is that the fatherly version of a compliment?" "The Godfather LY version," Sirius said, with something in his voice that was both amused and not. "There's a distinction." "What's the distinction?" "A father would have wrapped it up better," Sirius said. "Godfather version is I care about you deeply and I'd like you to stay alive, and I acknowledge that's not entirely in your control, and I'm going to do everything in my power to make it more likely that you do." He looked at Harry. "That's the whole speech." Harry looked back at him for a moment. "I'll take it," he said. They sat on the wall until the sky went properly pale and the fields came back out of the dark and the morning birds started their noise, and the farmhouse behind them, damaged, documented, compromised and due to be vacated, caught the first light on its stone and looked, for a moment, simply like a house in the country at sunrise, ordinary and still and there. Kingsley came to the garden door at 5:30 with tea and the news that Arthur Weasley had replied and the burrow was ready. "Molly wants everyone there by lunch," Kingsley said. Harry got off the wall. Looked at the farmhouse one more time. "Right," he said. "Let's go." Chapter 6, the beginning. The burrow looked exactly like itself, which was the best thing about it. It had no business standing upright by any architectural principle that Kingsley could identify. It had been added to laterally and vertically in apparent defiance of planning and physics both, each new room a slightly different shade of something, the whole structure held together by magic and decades of Molly Weasley's particular and formidable will. The garden was full of gnomes that Fred and George had apparently been encouraging rather than degnoming, and there was a broom leaning against the side of the house that had lost 2 of its twigs and had not been repaired because someone had been meaning to and hadn't yet, and the kitchen window was open and the smell coming through it was something with pastry in it, and the wards were, Kingsley took a moment just to feel them, layered and strong and old, the specific texture of magic that has been maintained with daily attention for a very long time. He let himself feel the tension of the last 2 weeks adjust slightly. Not release. He didn't release tension until situations were resolved, and this situation was not resolved. But adjust. Harry walked through the garden gate and stopped walking for exactly 2 seconds, taking in the burrow with an expression that was almost too private to observe, not overwhelm, not sentimentality, just recognition. The look of a person arriving somewhere that their nervous system has already categorized as safe and that the rest of them is still catching up to. Molly came through the back door before they'd made it halfway up the path. She was wearing an apron and she had flour on her left hand and she didn't slow down between the door and Harry, just walked directly to him the way she always did, and Harry met her halfway, which he hadn't done the last time, and that small difference, Harry moving toward rather than receiving, told Kingsley everything about the last 2 weeks in a single image. "You're all right," Molly said, into his hair. "We're all right," Harry said. "Nobody was hurt." "I know nobody was hurt," Arthur told me. "I'm allowed to check myself." She pulled back and looked at him, the whole of him, the assessment of someone taking inventory. She saw the new glasses. She saw the improved fit of the robes. She saw something in the quality of his face that she apparently liked, because her expression settled from worried to something warmer. "You look different," she said. "Better or worse?" Harry said. "Just different," she said. "More like yourself." She let him go and turned to Kingsley with the full force of her attention, which was considerable. "You'll stay," she said. "Not a question." "For a while," Kingsley said. "I need to be accessible to the ministry, but I don't want Harry without." "You'll stay," Molly said again. "We have the room. Arthur's already set it up." She went back toward the kitchen. "Breakfast in 20 minutes. All of you." Ron led the general carrying of bags upstairs, which in the burrow meant navigating a staircase that had a different opinion about its own geometry every time you used it. Hermione had apparently been here since the previous evening. Kingsley had arranged her transfer from the safe house before dawn, and she appeared on the landing with a book and the expression of someone who had slept 2 hours and felt completely fine about it. Kingsley put his bag in the room Arthur had prepared, small, slightly tilted, with a window that looked out at the garden and the chicken coop and the particular organized chaos of the Weasley outdoor space, and stood at the window for a moment doing what he always did in a new location, which was place himself in it. Exits. Approach vectors. The sight lines from the nearest road. Molly's wards, layered and intelligent, the specific architecture of them reassuringly complex. His Patronus went to Proudfoot at 8. Moving to secondary location, address follows. Maintain processing of last night's subjects. I need preliminary identification reports by noon. Proudfoot's reply came in 6 minutes, which meant Proudfoot had been at the ministry since before dawn. All 6 in holding. 3 positively identified. 1 minor, 17. Interesting. Call when you're settled. Kingsley looked at the last line. A 17-year-old among last night's attackers. He put that in the place where he kept things that needed to be thought about carefully and went downstairs for breakfast. Molly's kitchen was exactly what a kitchen should be when 8 people needed to eat breakfast after a night that had involved spellfire and a compromised safe house and approximately 4 hours of collective sleep. It was warm and it was loud and it smelled of bacon and coffee and something baked, and Arthur was already at the table reading a report he'd brought home from the ministry with the expression of a man who was trying to work while also monitoring the room for the state of everyone in it. Fred and George appeared from somewhere, they were always appearing from somewhere, and looked at Harry with the specific assessment of people who have heard a second-hand account and are now reconciling it with the primary source. Fred said, "Heard you caught a wand left-handed mid-combat." George said, "Don't tell us it's not impressive, we know it's impressive." Harry said, "It was a practice drill." Fred and George exchanged a look that said they were choosing to believe the more dramatic version regardless. Ginny was at the end of the table with a glass of pumpkin juice and the watchful quiet she sometimes had, not shyness, something more deliberate, the observation mode of someone taking careful stock. She looked at Harry with the directness that was specific to her and said, "You all right?" And Harry said, "Yeah, you?" And she said, "I wasn't the one who had 6 Death Eaters in my house," and Harry said, "They were in my house, not on top of me," and Ginny looked at him for a moment and then laughed, and the laugh was genuine and sharp and it broke something in the texture of the morning. Sirius arrived through the flue at 9:15. Kingsley had arranged the address and the permission with Arthur the previous night, and the arrival had a quality to it that was different from the safe house arrivals. In the burrow, in the noise and warmth of Molly's kitchen with 7 other people and the smell of breakfast, Sirius looked like someone who had been handed something they'd forgotten they were allowed to want. He sat at the table and Molly put food in front of him without asking what he wanted and he ate it and talked to Arthur about nothing in particular and looked, underneath the talking, like a man slowly remembering what it felt like to be in a place rather than on the run from one. Kingsley took his Patronus reports in the garden after breakfast because the kitchen was not a good place for operational communication and also because the morning had turned genuinely warm, the first proper July day they'd had, and there was value in standing in the sun for 10 minutes. Proudfoot's report on the 6 attackers was thorough. 3 identified, Avery, already noted, a man named Selwyn who had been quietly active in a legal practice in Edinburgh and whose name had come up in 2 cold case investigations from the First War, and a woman named Travers who had served time in Azkaban and been released in 1991 on appeal. The 3 unidentified were working through cross-referencing processes. The minor, 17, male, had been separated for a juvenile processing track, which was the correct procedure and which Kingsley intended to look at personally. He'd been recruited, that was clear. The question was how recently, and what he knew, and whether there was a thread back to whoever had provided the safe house address. Calder's report came while he was still in the garden. Her Patronus, the silvery otter, materialized above the herb bed that Molly kept near the back wall and said, in the brisk professional shorthand that Calder used when she had a lot to get through, Mundungus Fletcher confirmed. He met with a contact in Knockturn Alley 6 days ago. We have a memory witness, Goblin at Borgin and Burke's who was closing up and has no love for Death Eater trade disrupting his business. Dung sold the address for 12 galleons and a fake antique. Dumbledore has been informed. He's dealing with it. I'll have the full report by 2:12 galleons. Kingsley stood in the garden and looked at the herb bed and thought about that. Not with surprise, he'd known it was Mundungus, or known it was probable enough to count as certain, but with the specific, contained fury that he kept for moments when his assessment of human capacity for carelessness was confirmed. 12 galleons. He sent a Patronus back to Calder, confirmed. Get me the memory witness in the formal record before anyone can access Mundungus first. I want it sealed. And then stood in the sun for another 30 seconds because he'd promised himself 30 seconds and he intended to have them. Harry appeared at the garden door. He had a mug and the forward-looking expression that Kingsley had come to recognize as his working face, the face he wore when he was thinking through something rather than past it. "Calder," he said, looking at where the otter had been. "Confirmed," Kingsley said. Harry nodded. 12 galleons? Kingsley turned to look at him. "How did you know that?" "I didn't," Harry said. "But it felt like the kind of thing that would be a small amount." He came out into the garden and stood beside Kingsley, looking at the burrow's odd, comfortable shape against the blue sky. "What happens to him?" "Dumbledore's handling it," Kingsley said. "Mundungus won't be facing criminal charges. What he did was stupid and negligent, but proving the causal link between selling an address and the attack would require establishing that he knew the buyer's intention, which he probably didn't. He'll be removed from the order. Possibly more." "And the 17-year-old, Harry said." Kingsley looked at him. "You heard the Patronus." "Your Patronus doesn't mute itself," Harry said. "Sorry. I wasn't trying to." Kingsley considered this. "He's in juvenile processing," he said. "He'll be interviewed. If he cooperates, there's a route to a lesser charge. If he doesn't, he faces the same proceedings as the adults." Harry was quiet for a moment. "How old were the people who joined Voldemort the first time?" "Some of them." "Some were younger than 17, Kingsley said. "So when we catch them," Harry said, and the "we" was deliberate and unself-conscious, "we need to know the difference between someone who's a Death Eater and someone who was told the wrong things at the wrong age by the wrong people." He looked at Kingsley. "Those aren't the same problem." "No," Kingsley said. "They're not." Harry looked at the garden for a moment. "I'm not saying let them go," he said. "I'm saying know the difference." He looked at Kingsley steadily. "Voldemort recruits people who feel like the world doesn't have room for them. The best counter-recruitment is making sure they're wrong about that." Kingsley looked at him. 15 years old, standing in a garden the morning after 6 people came to his safe house with the intention of killing or capturing him, talking about the structural conditions of Death Eater recruitment with the considered clarity of someone who had thought about it from a personal angle and arrived at a position that was both principled and strategically sound. "You should write that down," Kingsley said. "I'll remember it," Harry said. "I know. Write it down anyway. Things that matter should be in the record." Harry looked at him with a slight expression that knew exactly what Kingsley was doing, keeping the thread of everything important documented, the way he'd been doing since before the raid. He almost smiled. "All right," he said. "I'll write it down." Dumbledore arrived at the Burrow at 2 in the afternoon, and the meeting he'd convened happened in the garden because Molly's sitting room was occupied by Fred, George, and a project involving something that smelled of sulfur and optimism, and the kitchen was in active use, and the garden was large enough and the day was good enough and, Kingsley thought, there was something right about having this particular conversation outside in the light. The Order members present were Kingsley, Sirius, Lupin, Arthur, and Molly because this was her house and she had never once accepted being managed out of an important conversation that happened in it, and also because she was, whatever the Order's official structures said, essential. Tonks came through the flue at 2:05 with her hair a bright, almost aggressive yellow and her expression carrying the specific alert energy of someone who has been running on adrenaline for 36 hours and is not going to stop yet. Harry was there. He sat in a garden chair beside Sirius and nobody suggested he shouldn't be, because the conversation about whether Harry attended his own strategic planning meetings had been had and resolved. Dumbledore opened with Mundungus, which was correct, get the wound acknowledged before you try to work around it. He was direct about it, Mundungus had compromised the safe house location, the evidence was clear, and he was being removed from the Order with immediate effect. He would not face criminal charges. Kingsley had explained the causal link problem, but his access to any Order information was terminated as of today. There was no argument from anyone in the garden, which told Kingsley something about how long several of these people had had reservations they'd kept polite about. The Order's internal communication structure needs revision, Kingsley said, when the Mundungus matter had been set aside. We've been operating on a need-to-know basis but without clear protocols for what triggers the need-to-know determination. That has to change. Location information for any protected person needs a specific clearance tier. Agreed, Arthur said immediately. I'll draft a protocol, Hermione said, from the doorway of the house, where she had apparently been standing for approximately 5 minutes without anyone noticing. Molly started to say something about not attending adult meetings. She stays, Harry said, without looking up from his garden chair. Molly looked at Harry. Then at Hermione. Then she sighed with the quality of a woman who has already decided to lose this particular battle and is managing the terms of her defeat. Pull up a chair, she said. Hermione pulled up a chair. The intelligence portion of the meeting was Lupin's. He'd received a full briefing that morning from a source that he didn't name and that Kingsley noted Dumbledore did not ask him to name, which meant it was someone operating in a space that required protection even within the Order. Voldemort was consolidating in the north, using Malfoy Manor as an apparent secondary base for Western operations. The graveyard attack had been a restoration, and Voldemort was physically present in a way he hadn't been for 14 years, which meant his capacity for direct action was returning. The Death Eater attack on the safe house had been operationally independent. Lupin's source confirmed it had not been directly ordered by Voldemort, which meant either Fudge's panic or Inner Circle initiative, both of which had implications. If Fudge's people provided the location to Death Eater contacts, Kingsley said, that crosses from political obstruction into material support for a terrorist organization. The evidentiary standard is high but not impossible. You're not going after Fudge, Sirius said, with the tone of someone testing a proposition. I'm going to build a case against Fudge, Kingsley said. Properly, thoroughly, with everything in the record that it needs to be in. When the case is ready, it goes to the Wizengamot Oversight Board. He looked around the garden. Not before it's ready. When it's ready. And in the meantime he's still minister, Tonks said. In the meantime he's still minister and he's making decisions from a position of increasing desperation, which means he'll make mistakes, which means the case will build faster than he expects. Kingsley looked at Dumbledore. The Wizengamot Oversight Board has Ogden's notation. They have the tribunal record. After last night they also have the attack documentation. At some point the weight of the record becomes the story regardless of what the prophet runs. Dumbledore was looking at him with the expression he'd been wearing more and more frequently over the last 2 weeks, the look of a man who had for a long time been the most strategically minded person in any room and was finding the experience of not being that, just occasionally, both surprising and not unwelcome. You've been building toward Fudge since before the raid, he said. Since March, Kingsley said. Fudge's obstruction of the Death Eater activity reports last year, that was the starting point. The Dursley case was real and necessary on its own terms, but it was also the case that couldn't be buried. Too much physical evidence. Too many independent witnesses. Too far outside ministry jurisdiction to be suppressed through normal channels. He looked around the table. Every piece of documentation since Tuesday adds to a record that has Fudge's fingerprints on the suppression side of it. We don't need to catch him doing one big thing. We need to document him doing 100 small things, and then someone who isn't me or Dumbledore or Harry makes the determination. Ogden, Lupin said. Among others, Kingsley said. The garden was quiet for a moment, the particular productive quiet of people processing a picture that is larger than the frame they'd been looking through. Harry said, the prophecy. He said it without preamble, looking at Dumbledore. I've been thinking about it. Neither can live while the other survives. Does it say anything about how? It does not, Dumbledore said. So I don't have to use a specific method. No. And the knowledge and skills I develop between now and whenever that happens are relevant. Real. Not just things I'm doing while I wait. Dumbledore looked at him steadily. Everything you learn is real, Harry. Everything you become is relevant. The prophecy does not specify an untrained boy meeting his destiny. It specifies only the outcome. He paused. I had perhaps, in the past, allowed the circumstances to suggest otherwise. That was my error. Harry nodded. Then I want the preparation to continue. Formally. Not just when we have time. I have already arranged it, Dumbledore said. I want a say in the content. Another of those half-second pauses. You shall have one. Good, Harry said, and settled back in his chair with the air of a man who has said the things he needed to say and is comfortable with where they've landed. Sirius, beside him, was looking at the sky with an expression that was composed entirely of contradictory feelings held at once, grief and pride and love and something almost like relief, and he reached over without looking and gripped Harry's shoulder once, briefly, and Harry put his hand over his godfather's hand the way he had in the farmhouse hallway, and neither of them made anything of it, and it was exactly right. The sentencing hearing for Vernon Dursley happened on a Tuesday, 3 weeks after the tribunal, and it was short. Marchetti had advised conciseness, which was advice she was constitutionally suited to give. The welfare assessment had come back thorough and unambiguous. The ministry specialist, a woman named Thornton who had been doing this work for 30 years, had submitted a report that was 26 pages and whose conclusion occupied exactly one sentence. The evidence supports substantiation of all charges, and the court's findings should reflect the severity and duration of the documented mistreatment. Whitmore had submitted a mitigation statement that was competent and sad in exactly the way his closing argument had been. Vernon was not, it noted, a magical person and had not understood the framework of obligations he'd been placed within. He had struggled with an unusual and difficult domestic situation. He had, in his own way, provided. Marchetti responded to the mitigation statement in 2 paragraphs that began the fact that Mr. Dursley is not a magical person does not alter the legal or moral requirements of the care he was entrusted with, and ended the tribunal has already determined what happened. The sentencing should reflect what happened, fully. Ogden agreed. Vernon received a formal conviction under the Magical Minors Protection Act, a 5-year supervision order that required quarterly ministry welfare checks on any minor in his custody, a prohibition on unsupervised contact with Harry Potter, and a substantial fine that was calibrated against his income and assets and was going to be felt. He also received something that was not part of the legal sentence but that Ogden added to the record at the close of the hearing, a formal notation that the treatment of Harry Potter had constituted a sustained and deliberate failure of the duty of care, and that this notation would remain permanently on the ministry's record of the case. Permanent. Irremovable. Real. Harry sat through the hearing in the chair beside Marchetti and looked at his uncle and felt, he told Kingsley afterward, in the Borough Garden with his elbows on his knees and a flat, honest expression, not triumph and not satisfaction and not the specific relief he'd expected. He felt something more like completion. The recognition of a chapter that had ended rather than one that had been won. The difference mattered. What do I feel instead of victory, he said, to Kingsley. You feel like it's over, Kingsley said. This part. Yeah. Harry looked at the garden. That's it. That's exactly it. That's what justice actually feels like, Kingsley said. Most people expect it to feel like winning. It feels more like closing. Harry thought about that. Is that enough? Kingsley looked at him. It's more than most people get, he said. So yes. It's enough. Petunia's statement hearing was quieter, and it produced different things. She sat across from Marchetti and Calder and answered every question with a precision that suggested she had been preparing for this conversation for some time, not to lie in it but to be accurate in it, to say the true things in their true shape without softening them into something they weren't. She talked about Lily. She talked about the night Harry arrived on the doorstep, the letter, the shock of it, the fear underneath the shock, and she was honest about the fear in a way that was, Calder noted in her report, more self-aware than most witnesses managed. She was not charged. The evidence didn't support it, and more honestly, Thornton's assessment had noted that Petunia's role in the mistreatment had been largely one of omission rather than commission, the failure to intervene, the failure to correct, the passive permission of a dynamic established by someone else. That was not blameless. But it was a different kind of culpability, and the law drew the distinction. Harry wasn't at that hearing. He'd been asked if he wanted to be and had thought about it for 24 hours and said no. Not because he had nothing to say, but because he'd decided that this particular piece of the record didn't need him in it. Petunia was answering for Petunia. He could let that happen without being there to watch it. It was, Kingsley thought, a mature decision, made from a position of genuine choice by someone who was increasingly comfortable with having those. On the morning that Kingsley received the notification of his appointment as head of the Auror office, he was in the Borough kitchen with a cup of tea and a stack of case notes and the background noise of a household that had settled into the easy volume of people who are comfortable with each other. The letter was brief. It was from the Wisengamot Oversight Board, co-signed by Ogden, and it informed him that following a review of DMLE performance and leadership over the preceding quarter, review was a generous description of what had been, in practice, a fairly pointed evaluation. The board had determined that the head of the Auror office position, which had been nominally filled by a deputy for 8 months pending a permanent appointment, should be filled permanently, effective immediately, and that the board's recommendation was Kingsley Shacklebolt. There was a second letter, below it, from Dumbledore, which contained 3 sentences. Congratulations, Kingsley. The position is yours because you earned it in the only way positions like this should be earned, by doing the work before anyone gave you the title. I am glad you are in it. Kingsley read both letters. Set them on the table. Drank his tea. Harry appeared in the kitchen doorway in the unhurried way of someone who has learned that mornings do not require rushing, looked at Kingsley's face, and said, "Good news or complicated news?" "Both," Kingsley said. He pushed the letters across the table. Harry read them. He read them with the same careful attention he gave everything, and when he looked up, his expression was the specific combination of genuine happiness and uncomplicated appreciation that he wore when something happened to someone he cared about. "Head of the Auror office," he said. "Yes. That's, Kingsley, that's significant." "It is," Kingsley agreed. "That means you're running the entire Auror Corps," Harry said. "Every case, every deployment, every investigation, I'm aware of what the position entails," Kingsley said, with a slight quality. "I'm just," Harry stopped. The uncomplicated happiness settled into something more considered. "You're going to change things," he said. "The way the Auror office works. What it pays attention to. What it considers worth documenting." "I intend to," Kingsley said. "The Death Eater cases," Harry said. "The suppressed activity reports from last year. Fudge's interference with those. Will all be reviewed," Kingsley said. "Formally, by the full office, not a single senior officer acting outside his jurisdiction." Harry was quiet for a moment. "Then, what about the Azkaban convictions? The people locked up for being suspected Death Eaters after the First War. Some of them were probably not what they were convicted as." Kingsley looked at him carefully. "Are you asking about Sirius?" "Sirius, and whoever else," Harry said. "I'm asking about the principle." "It's a correct principle," Kingsley said. "And yes. It'll be a review process, formal and slow and involving a lot of people who are not going to be happy about it. But it'll happen." He held Harry's gaze. "I promise you it'll happen." Harry nodded, and the expression he wore was the most complicated one Kingsley had seen on him, relief and grief and a particular fierce hope, all of it held together by the composure that had been building all summer. "Thank you," he said, and it carried more than the words. "Thank Ogden," Kingsley said. "She's the one who convened the review." "I will," Harry said, with genuine intention. "Tell me how." "Write her a letter," Kingsley said. "Formal. Clear. Your name on it." "My name might cause problems." "Your name on a letter to the chief adjudicator of the Wisengamot Oversight Board is not a problem," Kingsley said. "It's a statement. Write it." Harry thought about it for precisely 3 seconds. "All right," he said. The letter Harry wrote to Ogden was 2 paragraphs. It thanked her for the tribunal and for the notation, by name and specifically. It expressed his support for the review process for historical DMLE cases. It was signed Harry James Potter in handwriting that was a person's actual handwriting, not a performance of one, and it was sent by owl that same afternoon. Ogden replied 4 days later, in a letter that was 3 sentences and which ended, "Mr. Potter, I look forward to the day when your testimony is the beginning of accountability rather than the end of a fight to be heard. That day is coming. G. Ogden." Harry read it 3 times and then folded it carefully and put it in the inside pocket of his robes, which is where people put the things they want to keep close. The conversation between Harry and Dumbledore that had been needed for years happened on an evening in late July, in the Burrow Garden, after everyone else had gone in for dinner and the 2 of them had by unspoken agreement stayed outside. The light was going warm and long across the grass and the gnomes had retreated for the evening and it was very quiet, the kind of summer quiet that has crickets in it. Dumbledore had brought something with him that he set on the garden table without ceremony, a small pensieve, Hogwarts issued, and 2 sealed vials. "I'd like to show you something," he said. "2 memories. One is mine. One belonged to a man named Bob Ogden, who was a ministry official in the 1930s and whose memory came to me through a rather long chain of acquisition." He looked at Harry. "They concern Tom Riddle's history. His origins." Harry looked at the vials. "You're starting now," he said. "The private lessons." "I am starting now," Dumbledore said. "With what I should perhaps have started with in your first year, or your third, or certainly your fourth, the understanding that the person you will have to face is not a symbol or a force. He is a person with a history, and knowing his history is the most important advantage you have." "Because his history is his weakness," Harry said. "Yes," Dumbledore said. "Would you like to see?" Harry looked at the pensieve. He looked at Dumbledore. And then, without drama, without hesitation, with the same steady forward orientation that he'd been bringing to everything since a Tuesday morning in July when someone had finally shown up and told the truth about his life, he said, "Show me everything." Dumbledore looked at him, and the expression on his face was one that would have been difficult to describe precisely, something that lived in the space between admiration and love and the particular grief of a man who has made mistakes he cannot unmake and is learning, late but genuinely, to do better. He reached for the first vial. "Then we begin," he said. Kingsley stood at the kitchen window after dinner and watched the 2 figures in the garden and thought about the morning 3 weeks ago when he'd driven up a Surrey lane in the pre-dawn dark with a warrant in his breast pocket and 4 years of documentation and the absolute conviction that what he was about to do was right. He thought about Vernon Dursley in silver restraints. He thought about Calder's 42-page attack report. He thought about Ogden's unprompted notation. He thought about the letter with 3 signatures that he'd put in his pocket at midnight and carried into a quiet street and used to change the shape of a life. He thought about Harry at 5:57 in the morning in a doorway, thin and careful and not yet sure he was allowed to be seen. He looked at Harry in the garden now, leaning forward in his chair, watching the pensive silver light with the whole of his attention, asking questions that Dumbledore was answering fully, both of them lit by the long evening gold and the cool shimmer of old memories, and the space between them had something in it that hadn't been there 3 weeks ago. Not easy, not uncomplicated, there was too much history for easy. But honest. Actively, effortfully honest, in the way that things between people who owe each other honesty and have decided to pay it can be. Sirius appeared at Kingsley's elbow with a glass of something and the expression of a man who has been watching the same thing from slightly further back and has a lot of feelings about it. "He's going to be all right," Sirius said. "You keep saying that," Kingsley said. "I keep needing to," Sirius said. "It keeps being true." He looked at the garden. "He's going to be more than all right." "Yes," Kingsley said. "He is." Molly came past with a dish and said, without pausing, "Stop watching them, it's not subtle," and Kingsley and Sirius both looked away from the window with the specific non-guilty expression of people who are completely guilty. From the garden, Harry's voice carried through the open window, asking something. Kingsley couldn't make out the words, just the tone, the forward, focused, unafraid quality of it. Dumbledore's answer carried something different than it used to. Less careful. More real. The war was coming. It was already here, at every edge, pressing on every decision with the constant low-grade pressure of something that had started and would not stop until it was finished. There were Death Eaters in Ministry holding cells. There was a boy with a prophecy in a garden learning the history of the man he'd have to face. There was a minister making frantic calculations in an office on level 2, and a chief adjudicator with a very good memory, and 6 sealed memory vials that Dumbledore had apparently been collecting for years against exactly this moment. And in the middle of all of it, in a garden in Devon on a warm July evening, a 15-year-old was leaning forward in a chair and demanding to know everything, and being told everything, and handling it the way he handled everything, with the clear, forward-facing attention of a person who has decided the truth is worth knowing, however large it is, and who is not afraid of the answer. Kingsley turned back to the kitchen table and his notes and the beginning of the new case files that would carry the head of the Auror office's signature for the first time, and he thought, with the satisfaction of a man who builds things properly, this is where it starts. Not the war. The war had already started. The answer. The real, considered, properly built answer. This is where that starts. He picked up his quill and began.